Chapter 1275. When Brando returned to the top deck, the ship was sailing out of the waterway between Tawade Island and Port Gussel with full sails. The two ships of Tarkus in front had also slowed down, waiting for them to catch up. On one side of the sea was the rugged rocks of Tawade Island, which looked as white as phosphorus under the moonlight. The wind blew from the south of Gussel, causing the hull of the ship to sway slightly with the waves. Since Timmy's had passed through the clouds, the visibility on the sea was extremely high. He could clearly see the wall of fog moving slowly on the east side of the Therese Strait. There seemed to be countless ships in the thick fog stretching out endlessly. The ships formed a wall between them and the masts were faintly discernible. There were hundreds and thousands of ships in the wall. What made his face turn sour was that the fog was slowly approaching the west coast of the Torres Strait, which was where they were. It seemed that the fog was going to merge with the fog coming out of Port Gussel. This was not a big deal, but the problem was that their three ships were sandwiched in the middle. There was a dead silence on the deck. The people who were celebrating earlier were now speechless. They were still confident that they could pass through the thin fog in Port Gussel, but the wall of fog in front of them stretched for hundreds of miles, and they could not see the end of it on the wide sea. It was impossible to go around it. When Brando came out with Delphian and Insursta behind him, everyone subconsciously looked at him. Previously, he had led them out of the Bay of Gussel, and everyone subconsciously thought that Brando was the one who could solve the problem at hand. But Brando was actually unsure at the moment. He looked at the wall of clouds moving slowly on the surface of the sea with a solemn face, and he could not make up his mind. Tarkus had once sent a ship into the fog, and the ship returned the way it came, seemingly unaffected. But the state of the fog at that time was not the same as now. As for going around it, that was a joke. The fog had appeared since Rosaline, and they had been sailing north for 3 days without seeing its end. Who knew where the other end of the fog was? But the fog of Port Gussel was coming from the waterway behind them, and it seemed that the only thing they could do now was to continue sailing north. If there was no other way, they could only abandon the ship and go ashore. The fog could not go too far into the land. Although the ports along the coast had suffered, there were always safe places inland. It all depended on whether they could travel that far in a short period of time and leave the area covered by the fog. Brando turned his head and asked, "What's the terrain in the north? Is there a suitable place to go ashore? It would be best if it's a harbor that can shelter from the wind, and has mountains or hills nearby." Insursta thought for a moment, then replied, "Yes, there are, but there are places like this that have all become harbors, Count. Of the ports and other places. Of the ports and other places. And?" However, due to the steep terrain of the western shore of the Tawu Strait, there were not many places to build a harbor. Therefore, the few places that were available were all used by humans or undead. It was really difficult to find a natural and undeveloped anchorage. "I know of such a place, teacher." At this time, Huanghua came over and looked at them. "What? But I've never been there. I've only heard of it. I heard that there's a pirate hideout in the Bay Canyon near Sopalach. I think if the pirates can use that place as their lair, we can also go ashore there." "I've heard of that place too." Insursta seemed to be reminiscing, but there was not much joy on his pale face. "But no one knows where the lair is. The fjords near Sopalach have a complicated terrain. If we find the wrong place, we'll be in trouble." Brando looked back at the dark sea between Tawade Island and Gussel. The fog spread faster under the influence of the south wind, and the wall of fog on the Tawade Strait was coming in their direction. They did not have many choices left. "It's better than waiting for death," he replied. "We have to try. How far is that place from here? Can we get there in time?" "It's not far." Delphian knew the question was directed at her. She had already memorized the map of Swift Plains. Sopalach is north of Gussel. It's only 100 nautical miles from here. It's one of the largest ports on the other side of the strait. But the history of this port is actually very short. It was only discovered during the year of the spider poison. But Sopalach has a wide belly and a narrow mouth. It's a natural shelter from the wind. The water in the port is more than 8 meters deep. It can accommodate almost all kinds of merchant and military ships in the Nine Phoenix region. It's an excellent natural port. It's said that it has the conditions to build a spaceport. 100 nautical miles was a distance that would take a normal person several days to cover on land. But it was not a long distance on the sea. The 3 ships were excellent armed merchant ships. The fastest could reach 12 knots with full sail, and the slowest could reach 10 knots. With the south wind blowing, they should be able to see the coastline of Sopalach by tomorrow morning. But that was only in theory. Only the heavens knew if the fog would actually give them that much time. Even though Brendel had some knowledge of sailing, he was not completely clueless. He could not calculate how fast the fog was moving on the surface of the sea, but at least he could tell that it was definitely not going to give them 10 hours of time. Half of that was good enough. Is the surrounding terrain very complicated? Sopa Latch is on the glacier belt. To the east is the southern edge of the Nine Phoenix Great Glacier. The movement of the glacier and the erosion of ice and snow easily created the complicated sea cliffs and fjords. In fact, the entire coastline of the western side of the Torres Strait is affected by similar geological changes. Only in the warmer area on the southeast side of the strait, the rivers after the melting of the glacier formed the alluvial plains. Brando understood. The Great Glacier of Wonde was located to the east of Fanzan and to the north of the Great Plains of Saint Tassol. But the term Great Glacier was actually a broad geographical concept. Its part in Wonde was only its westernmost edge. This glacier, or ice sheet, was a more appropriate name. It was the impasse to the west of Wonde. It was also the largest part of the Black Forest, outside the borders of Wonde. Of course, the Black Forest was far from just a forest. This glacier extended to the east and no one knew where its boundary was. It then went south across the Kherson Strait and intersected with part of the border of Madara. After that, it crossed the Torres Strait and became a huge part of the impasse on the northern border of the Nine Phoenix Great Glacier. And this part of the Nine Phoenix Great Glacier was the thing that the Prime Minister's daughter mentioned. Brando pondered for a moment and looked at Insursta. Go and signal Mr. Tarkus. We are heading north. Our destination is Sopa Latch. By the way, how many liches do you have on board? Must they be middle-ranked or above? He suddenly asked. Insursta was stunned for a moment and did not understand the meaning of this question. Not many, Count. Including the adjutant on this ship, there are no more than 5. So few. Brando was a little puzzled. He knew that in Madara, liches were the most important part of the army. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were the backbone of the army, especially in this era where their undead summoning magic had not been improved. There were no elite skeleton warriors at the basic level, no assassin undead, and no cheap necromancer apprentices. Liches were the most important mid-ranked and low-ranked commanders of the undead. Moreover, liches were Madara's most precious and rare technical troop class. Like the Navy before the appearance of the intelligent elite skeleton warriors, the general skeleton warriors were at most used as cannon fodder. That was to say, they were used in boarding battles or landing battles. If they were used as sailors, they could at most handle simple tasks such as cleaning the deck or rowing the ship. In fact, only liches with a certain level of intelligence could be qualified as professional sailors. How could there be only 5 professional sailors on such 2 large ships? Brando was a little puzzled. In Rosaline we usually use humans to supplement the sailors. The humans here often deal with us. If we can afford it, they won't mind working for us. After all, we are not a real warship. It is impossible for mid-ranked liches to be equipped with so many of them. Those things are also very precious to us. Insursta shook his head and smiled bitterly. Actually, there are still some in Rosaline, but we didn't think of bringing them out. What do you need them for? Brendel was a little speechless. Professional human sailors were actually stronger than necromancers. Middle-ranked necromancers had intelligence, but there was a limit to it. High-ranked necromancers were no different from humans or even better, but how many of them were there in Madara? Most of them had become undead lords. However, it was a pity that what he needed now was not professional sailors but liches. Although liches could be sailors, their real function was not only to be sailors, but also to be part of the mid-ranked and low-ranked officers in Madara. More importantly, they were all mages. Although it might be a little lame. But that was enough. Seeing that Brando's expression was a little unpleasant, Insursta, who had learned to read people's expressions these days, quickly said, "But there are still many low-ranked liches, Earl." Brando shook his head. "No need. Let Tarkus gather the mid-ranked liches and send them here. I want to do something and I need a few mages to help." Chapter 1276. Insursta finally understood why Brando only wanted mid-level necromancers. Low-level necromancers that relied on bone staffs to cast spells obviously couldn't be called mages. They didn't have the ability to cast spells themselves. The vice-captain of Pull's Feathers, Lady Adney, had come over at some point. She heard their conversation and couldn't help but interrupt. "Actually, I know some magic too." Brando turned around in surprise. "Lady Adney, you know some magic. Do you have the level of a mage apprentice?" "A little higher than that, but really just a little." "That's enough." Brando waved his hand. He saw that Adney was about to speak again and interrupted her. "Double it." "What?" Adney's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. The reward, Brando replied with the face of a tycoon, I'll double the one we agreed on before. How about it? Of course, no problem. Wait, you're not lying to me, are you, Mr. Brando? A crystal drew an arc in the air and fell into her hand. This is the deposit, Brando said to her. Adney looked at the crystal and had the same reaction as Xen. She sucked in a breath of cold air. A flame-patterned crystal. This crystal alone was enough to cover half of their reward, and it was only a deposit. The vice captain immediately saw the extent of Brando's wealth and couldn't help but blurt out. By the name of Martha, my lord, do you still need retainers? Brando froze for a moment, thinking that it would be great if these mercenaries could join him. A dozen or so elemental enlightenment experts would almost double his strength in Tanajal. Of course, he replied at once, I welcome a capable person like Miss Adney at any time. Adney's eyes were almost shining. Good. When this is over, I'll definitely resign. Count, you can't go back on your words. Resign? Aren't you mercenaries? Brando couldn't help but laugh when he saw the knight lowering their heads and covering their faces. Even though he knew that these guys weren't mercenaries, he couldn't help but feel amused. If this world was filled with mercenaries of this level, the world would have been in chaos long ago. She did not expect Brendel to question her on this point. She stuttered to the point that she could not even speak properly. That, Count Brendel, the wind was too strong just now. Did you hear wrongly? Quill looked up at the sky and sighed. However, Brando didn't hold on to this matter. Since he already knew that these people's identities might not be that simple, he only needed to know if they had malicious intentions. But judging from the current situation, it didn't seem likely. At the very least, if assassins or spies were so incompetent, then there was probably no such thing as a successful assassination or leak of secrets in this world. Moreover, he still had other things to do. What he needed to do was to set up some simple wind magic circles. The speed of these ships clearly wasn't enough. Even if he added a few oars, it wouldn't help. After all, even if his oarsmen were heroes from the Argo that went to the sacred forest to retrieve the Golden Fleece, they wouldn't be able to double the speed of the ships. Moreover, these ships weren't sailing ships. If this was his original world, he might be helpless. But this was Wond, a world of magic. In fact, most sailing ships in this world were built with many magical materials, such as the lighter rudder that was enchanted with water magic and the wind sails that were enchanted with wind magic. This made them much faster than sailing ships in the real world. However, Brando knew that with the support of magic they could be even faster. However, first of all, this required a one-time magic storage item. Secondly, it also required the continuous support of a magician. Generally speaking, only floating battleships had this kind of treatment. He had never heard of sailing ships burning money like this. After all, most sailing ships in this world were merchant ships, and merchants always had to consider the cost. Brando didn't have a magician, but he knew that Madara had a lich. Even without the support of a bone staff, an intermediate lich was still at the level of an apprentice magician. As for the magic storage item, Brando planned to make it himself. Don't forget that he still had an alchemy level. Although he hadn't used it for a long time and it was almost rusty, and the ship didn't have an alchemy lab or any suitable materials, he didn't need these things. He had the blood sacrifice alchemy. Secondly, he had money. The second point was especially important. Brando planned to use magic crystals to make a magic storage array. He planned to use magic to directly release energy to simulate magic. This was the only way to simply and crudely bypass all the necessary materials. However, the price was naturally to burn money. Insursta had 5 mid-level liches under his command. If 2 of them were to maintain a magic circle, he would have to consider abandoning one of the ships. However, if that was the case, he would have to concentrate everyone on the remaining 2 ships, which would further slow down the ship's speed. Right now they were in a race against time. Every second the ship slowed down meant more danger. This was obviously not the result he wanted. Delphian was now a necromancer. Unfortunately, after she was sealed into a card by Brando, she wasn't summoned by the twin death moons. Therefore, her current power was not based on the Mephistopheles and Andrique. She was just a normal person like herself, so her ability was temporarily out of the question. Fortunately, Adeline also knew magic, so the problem was solved. However, if he were to make 3 magic arrays, Brando estimated that he would need to use at least half of the magic crystals he had on him. This number was shocking enough. After all, he had brought a lot of magic crystals from Tanajal. Later on, he replenished some from the fleet at Fathom Harbor. When he was in the elemental frontier, Miss Tada and the Termosian had also given him some. The latter part of the magic crystals was especially high quality. It could be said that half of the magic crystals he had on him was more than enough to build a frigate, let alone speed up the sailing ship. This was also the reason why merchants never used this method to speed up their sailing ships. Therefore, when Brando finished drawing the blood sacrifice array on the deck and then covered it with a layer of magic crystals, almost everyone on the ship was stunned. Most of them were people of status. Insursta was a noble in Madara, and the Knights of Ra's Wings were also of noble birth in Lubeck. Not to mention Huang Hua and Mr. Liu, although Fang Qi wasn't a noble in the Nine Phoenix, his birth was only higher than that. It wasn't that they hadn't seen alchemy before, but they had never seen such a rich alchemy. This wasn't alchemy at all. It was simply a joke with the magic crystals. Fang Qi stood at the side with his arms crossed. He was full of disdain for Brando's alchemy level. Apart from the somewhat strange blood sacrifice method, in his opinion, this country bumpkin from the west was indeed worthy of his identity as a country bumpkin. Few people knew that he, the genius of the Ghost Chariot clan, was also quite a genius in alchemy. Although he wasn't far superior to Tamar, he who had received systematic learning and education in alchemy, was at least not inferior to the alchemy masters that Brando knew. Not to mention the alchemy of the East and the West both had their advantages. At least at this moment, Brando's alchemy was basically not worth mentioning in his eyes. However, after a while he felt a little toothache. To be exact, he felt a little heartache for those magic crystals. It wasn't that the Ghost Chariot clan didn't have that much wealth, but that was the wealth of the entire organization. At least he didn't have that much money to squander. As for Miss Adney, she was tightly clinging to Quill's sleeve, almost unable to breathe. If it weren't for the Elven Ranger supporting her, she would have collapsed to the ground. Her eyes were filled with the radiance of magic crystals, sparkling brightly, and her mouth kept chanting as if she had been possessed. "Oh my God, Martha above Lord R, I'm not dreaming, am I? You also know alchemy?" Insursta looked at Brando with a little surprise, but he soon exclaimed in a fuss, "This is blood sacrifice alchemy. Isn't this taboo under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Oh my God, how can you do this? Hurry up and put away those magic crystals. If you don't lack money, just give them to me." But Brando didn't care about his clamor here. As soon as the magic circle was formed, he directly flipped Odorfeist's blade and gently cut his thumb. But this time it didn't cut. Brendel almost scared himself out of his wits. He quickly increased his strength and cut a second time. There was a sharp pain, and this time he barely managed to cut a thin wound. Then he saw a drop of golden blood flowing out from it. Brando couldn't help but be stunned. He knew how sharp the holy sword Odorfeist was. In the whole, the amber sword, there was probably no sword with a higher attack power than these holy swords. He was very careful before, afraid that he would cut off his finger. That would be too funny, but he never dreamed that he would have to use electricity to cut a hole in his body with Odorfeist. And what's with the color of the blood? He dared to swear that when he was in the elemental barrier, his body didn't have such changes. This was either some kind of mutation when he passed through the spatial crack of the magic storm, or the powerful life force of the nature orb during the explosion of Rosaline's body brought about changes to his body. In his heart he was more inclined to the latter. And just as Brando was stunned, the others were also stunned, but they didn't notice the color of the blood flowing out of Brando's body. They were shocked by the sudden flames of all the magic crystals on the magic circle. Adeline even let out a sigh mixed with many complicated feelings. This sigh was so melancholic that it made people who heard it feel disheartened, as if they were about to jump into the sea and commit suicide. Chapter 1277. The gray cliffs stood tall in the fog. Such a scene was often seen in the fjords around the Sopa Latch. They were like silent giants standing by the sea, and the ships passing under their feet were frighteningly small. The wind was somewhat cold. It was not the cold of autumn in Abes, but the temperature was bone-chilling. Because this was the south of the Great Glacier, when people talked about the Great Glacier, their faces would always change. The wind howled at the top of the canyon, making a sound like a ruler scraping through a rag. Dark clouds covered the fjords, making people feel as if the sky would collapse at any time. Logically speaking, under such bad weather, the fog should have been blown away. But the wind poured into the fjords, and the fog from the outside continued to pour in. Instead, the fog in the straits churned as if it would never stop. The fleet set off from Gussel, and took 3 to 4 hours to reach the Sopa Latch. Because the fog came from the north, they had to take refuge in the fjords in advance. The terrain in the Sopa Latch fjords was complicated. After traveling for half an hour through the winding straits, they could no longer distinguish between front and back. As for the pirates' hiding place, it was even more remote. Brando was not in a hurry. He used the lines of law to scan the surrounding fjords, carefully searching for the clues he wanted. Soon he found an unusual place. After a quarter of an hour, the fleet appeared there. It was a bay canyon with its own world in its belly. The entrance was at a 90-degree angle, blocking the wind from the outside, making this wide body of water appear somewhat tranquil. There was some thin mist floating on the surface of the water like a veil. In the depths of the canyon there was a huge cave entrance. The cave entrance was connected to the surface of the sea, allowing ships to navigate. In addition, it was located in the depths of the fjords, very hidden, and very suitable for pirates to hide. If he did not spread out his extreme planes, ordinary people would not be able to find it. When the three ships slowly sailed into the inner canyon, passing through the mist, they saw the huge cave entrance hanging alone on the cliff. Everyone could not help but look at the Count of Erewhon with respect and admiration. The journey had been fraught with danger, but Brendel had led them out of Gussel's encirclement, and then he had taken out a legendary amount of wealth and generously burned it to the ground, allowing the fleet to sail on the wind and arrive at Sopelake before dawn. Then he decisively ordered the fleet to hide in the fjords in advance, and with his own strength, he broke through the heavy fog and came to this place. Seeing the pirates' hiding place in front of them, even if they were on the opposing side, Insursta and Tarkus could not help but cheer for each other. It's not like Madara can't accept a noble from another country. Count, if you're willing to bow down to His Majesty, Aween will remain the same. Insursta did not know how many times he had said this in Brando's ear. Brando stood at the bow of the ship, looked back at him with a slight smile and shook his head. Can you promise this? And I have no intention of becoming the King of Erewhon. I will have a good talk with your Majesty, but it's hard to say who will be in charge. Insursta sighed. When these two met, it would be hard to predict what would happen. But even if Madara had another outstanding dark noble, it would be good. Subconsciously, he no longer regarded Brando as someone on the same level as himself, but compared him to the existence with the Mercury staff. But he was still not optimistic about Brando's chances. He did not have the slightest doubt about the rise of the Kingdom of the Dead Moon, and in another time and space, it was indeed the same. The three ships slowly sailed into the cave, and the surrounding light suddenly dimmed. Adni's Knight's men lit torches, and under the flickering light, they found that the inside of the cave was extremely wide. A wide and deep waterway went straight into the depths of the darkness, surrounded by smooth limestone walls. The cave was 30 to 50 feet high, and countless stalactites hung overhead. Brando and Tarkus originally planned to sail in at the risk of running the ship aground, but they did not expect the waterway to be so good. It had a very deep draft and looked like a natural harbor. Although the throughput may be a little small, it was extremely rare as an anchorage. God knows how the pirates found this place. The light of the torches slowly moved forward with the ship, illuminating the surrounding dark cave walls. The limestone walls of the cave were mixed with some kind of metal, which refracted a yellow light. But the deep waterway had an end. Soon they saw a small bay that could anchor one or two ships. At the other end of the bay, there seemed to be a simple dock. A crooked wooden trestle was built into the deep water and connected to the shore. At this moment there were no ships in the dock and no pirates. This made the knight, who had been ready to fight with weapons in hand, suddenly feel relieved. But they were a little unwilling. They had been chased all the way from Gussel like a stray dog, and the enemy was nowhere to be seen. To these masters of their respective fields who had the dignity of being masters, this was obviously very frustrating. Masters of elemental enlightenment were considered masters in every aspect, and to have such a group of people gathered together as mercenaries was probably something only Lady Adni could think of. Compared to that, they would rather fight to their heart's content, even if they lost. In the end, they did not even touch the pirates. The pirates did not anchor their ships in the port, which meant that they did not stay here. This was not surprising. After all, this was just a hideout, not their nest. Just like the temporary anchorages often used by smugglers, they would occasionally stay in those places when storms came, but they would not stay there permanently. Everyone felt lost, but in fact it was just a psychological effect. After all, if they could avoid fighting, no one would be willing to do it except for fanatical warmongers. The two ships entered the port one after the other. The Ghost Chariot clan's ship had been left outside, because no matter how big the cave was, it could not accommodate such a large armed merchant ship. A layer of mist hung in the cave just like the inner gorge outside, but it was much better than outside the fjord. The fleet in the mist had almost covered the entire Tawu Strait. Brando had never seen so many lost names in this life and his previous life, let alone others. After the ship was parked, everyone disembarked one by one. Then Tarkus ordered the skeleton soldiers on the ship to drill through the ship and let them sink here to prevent them from being used by outsiders. The first batch of skeleton soldiers who landed by boat had already explored the passage at the other end of the cave, so these ships were naturally not needed. Tarkus and Brando did not expect to wait until the mist outside dissipated before continuing to sail out to sea, not to mention that it was not necessarily safe dozens of miles offshore. They had to reach the real inland area to completely avoid the March of the Lost Names. This was also the reason why they did not directly force their way ashore from other places. After landing, they had to open up a path along the wilderness. Who knew when they would run into the marching route of the Lost Names? Since this was the pirates' landing point, there must be a safe land route behind it. Otherwise, this place would at most be a safe haven, not a temporary lair. As for whether sinking the ship would cause any trouble for the people behind it, Brando had never considered this issue. Why should he be so considerate for the pirates? As for Tarkus, he was even more disdainful to consider this. Even if the undead might reactivate this port in the future, they would have the means to salvage the sunken ship. As for the pirates? Who cared about this? After everyone got off the ship, the cave seemed a little cramped. After all, in addition to Brando, Delphian, and Phoenix Hua, there were 2 squadrons of skeleton soldiers and a group of low-level liches on the 2 armed smuggling ships from Madara. They were usually locked in the bottom cabin as ballast in Madara style. They would only be released when there was a battle or when they needed to land. In addition to the skeleton soldiers, there were also the sailors on the Ghost Chariot's armed merchant ship. There were also more than 10 people. Including the 2 elders and their servants as well as Fang Chi's subordinates and servants, there were about 20 to 30 people. Adni and her night men were another group. For a time, there were more than 100 people in the pirates' hiding place. It was obviously impossible for this small place to not look cramped. Tarkus divided 1.5 squadrons of skeleton soldiers, the other half was left in Gussel, into 2 groups. One group continued to act as cannon fodder in front, and 3 liches were in charge of commanding them. The other group, which was larger in number, was at the back. It was not to guard against anything but mainly to serve as a warning. If they encountered the Lost Names later, at least they could detect them in advance. They were still cannon fodder in essence. The sailors of the Phantom Chariot were naturally captives at this time, but no one cared about the ordinary sailors. The servants of the 2 elders of the Phantom Chariot were quite strong, so they were watched over by Adni's knight. Of course, Brando also paid for this. The female knight was very satisfied with Brando's generous employer. Only the 2 elders of the Phantom Chariot were a little troublesome for Brando and Tarkus. After all, they were Supreme Class Masters, although only half a step into the Supreme Class. Even if Deputy Marshal Brando was monitoring them, there would be problems if he was not careful. The 2 had obviously suffered a lot these days. They had been locked in the bottom cabin with the skeletons and liches, and the food they ate was worse than pig and dog meat. It was not that Tarkus deliberately slighted them, but that was all the sailors could eat at sea. The undead could not specially prepare a cook for the 2 captives. That was the treatment that only Brando and Delphian had. Chapter 1278. Because Fang Chi had always been in the hands of Tarkus and Insursta, they naturally did not dare to act rashly and endured. When Brando saw the 2 of them again, he almost could not recognize them. The 2 of them seemed to have aged 10 years in a few days. Even their wrinkles had increased a lot and they looked like they had reached the age of old. When the 2 of them saw Brando, they showed a look of horror at the same time. Obviously, the battle at Rosaline Port had left an indelible shadow in their hearts, especially the last confrontation between Brando and the Holy Jade Sword. That was almost beyond the imagination of mortals. Looking at the 2 of them, Brando knew that these 2 guys could not stir up any waves. At least in front of him, they did not dare to act rashly. He motioned to Tarkus to ignore the 2 of them and just keep an eye on Fang Chi. As for the latter, since coming out of Gussel Port, his originally arrogant nature had been restrained a lot. He did not dare to provoke him again. Brando saw a few times that the latter looked like he wanted to say something to him, but in the end he held back. He did not mind communicating with the other party, but when he thought of Delphian's instructions, he smiled and suppressed his thoughts. He thought that with this guy's funny temper, it would be good to keep him under control. In this way, Brando and Huang Hua, together with the unfathomable daughter of the Prime Minister, the smuggler Na Xian and his son, and the undead of Madara who were obviously not on the same side as them. In addition, there were the common captives of both sides, the successor of the Ghost Chariot clan and their genius of this generation, their 2 great elders and many sailors and servants. Finally, there was the female knight and her party who also obviously had other thoughts. Such a group of people with different thoughts gathered together at this moment. The skeletons in front of them had already explored the way. In the depths of the cave was a relatively narrow cave, but it was still dry. The terrain gradually went up as if it was connected to somewhere else. The knight followed behind, holding rosin torches. The flames were bright and dark, gradually outlining the outline of the cave. This was obviously a cave eroded by water. It might have originally flowed through an underground river. The underground river eroded the limestone here thousands of times, forming a complex cave system. In some places, it almost spiraled upward. The smooth stone surface or protruded from the surrounding stone walls, forming a cluster of beautiful stalactites. Such a scene was amazing at first, but after a long time, it was inevitable that it would be boring. Brando initially thought that they would be able to walk out of the cave in a quarter of an hour, but he did not expect to walk for a few hours. The cave was narrow at first, and they had to line up in a long line along the narrow path. But later it gradually became wider. The walls of the cave expanded in all directions, almost forming an open underground space. Moreover, it formed a precipice on one side. Looking from that direction, it was pitch black. Below the precipice was almost an abyss, and the light of the torch could not illuminate the end at all. Tarkus threw a stone down, and after a while, he heard the echoes of the stone. Brando extended his line of law downward and found that there was an underground lake below, at least 200 or 300 feet above the surface. As he continued to move forward, he heard the sound of water coming from the darkness. Although he couldn't see the direction, he could tell that it was a waterfall. It seemed that the original underground water had changed its course here and poured into the underground lake. But this underground space was frighteningly large. The pirates who originally stayed here would not have not discovered it. This was simply a natural hiding place. He now began to doubt his previous judgment. The previous port was a little too clean. With such a large hiding place, the pirates could not have completely ignored it. But where did they go? Brando did not know that while he was thinking about this problem, a few hundred meters away on the other side of the cliff in the darkness, between two stalactites, there was a pair of eyes looking over here. The dark eyes reflected the distant light of the fire. The owner of the eyes did not necessarily see Brando and the others clearly, but the light of such a bright torch was enough to spread far in the darkness. He stayed in place for a moment, then put a handful of beans in his mouth, chewed a few times and turned to leave. The man nimbly slid down a stone slope, as if the darkness was nothing to him. He circled around the stalactites a few times, found one of the caves and quickly went in. He did not go far before a faint light came from the front. Seeing the light, the man narrowed his eyes and quickened his pace. He walked to the corner and saw the scene in the cave where the light came from. It was a small stronghold. There were a few beds in the cave, and there were even more hammocks hanging in the air. A few cabinets filled every inch of the walls in the cave, and there were a few boxes scattered between the cabinets and the beds. Inside the cave, a few candles were lit, and there were more than a dozen people sitting on the beds. When the man barged in, the others looked back warily in his direction. The man ignored them and shouted, "Big sister? Lady White Mist, an outsider has barged in." Everyone turned their heads and looked into the depths of the cave. There was a cloth curtain there, and beside the stove outside the cloth curtain, there was a furry white cat curled up in a coiled position. When the cat heard the voice, it looked up and narrowed its eyes at the man. "Oh, another fat sheep has come in?" White Mist licked her whiskers and narrowed her eyes. "Where did they come from? Are they from Sopalach? Or are they other pirates? Or are they hiding from those who have lost their names?" "I don't know," the man replied. "But their team is a little strange." "How so?" "I see Madara skeletons and there seems to be people from Nine Phoenix and some foreigners." "Why would Madara skeletons be with people from Nine Phoenix?" "I think it's the tyrant of the Ghost Chariot clan from Swift Plains, big sister." The pirates immediately started to clamor. "Shut up," White Mist snapped. If not for the fact that she needed these people to help her gather information about Soparake and Elm Harbor, she would have thrown them into the sea to feed the fishes. Furthermore, she would not kill a single one of them wrongly. But if not for the fact that she had to take care of Hippamera, who was injured and unable to move, she would not have needed these people. She would have gone to Sopalach or Elm Harbor to gather information about Brando. But at least they were still useful for now. As an ancient witch spirit, White Mist did not have much sympathy for humans. These days she let these pirates go out to sea to help her plunder necessary supplies, food and water, mainly for Magadal and Hippamera, and she did not feel guilty at all. It was also for this reason that she instructed these people to avoid the lost names outside. Although she did not know what happened to Wand, as a witch spirit with thousands of years of experience, it was easy for her to recognize those damn things. It was for this reason, and the severe punishment she had given to these unruly gentlemen, that she had at this moment established a rudimentary authority in the community. A pirate group with a cat as their captain, it would be a joke if word got out. However, these gentlemen, the gentlemen of the sea, did not dare to laugh. In fact, when White Mist coldly spat out the 2 words "shut up," these 2 words produced the appropriate deterrent force they should have. Sure enough, the cavern became absolutely silent. Compared to a witch who had mastered ancient dark knowledge, the pirates' childish tricks were nothing. The witches weren't joking when they said they could pull out someone's tendons and skin them. That unlucky pirate was still hanging outside after being dried by the wind. Go and find out who it is. Don't kick an iron plate, I'm too lazy to come out and save you. The pirates nodded repeatedly. But at this time, the curtain behind her was suddenly gently lifted by a hand, and the silver elf Princess Medisha came out from inside, holding the wall. Her face was a little pale, but she spoke very firmly. "White Mist, I can feel the Lord." "What did you say?" "My lord, he is very close to us. My planeswalker authority has detected him, and my lord must have detected me too." "Really?" Brando did indeed feel the presence of Medisha at this moment. To be precise, he felt the existence of his secondary authority, and then he realized that it was the Silver Elf Princess, and then he felt the presence of Hippamera. The shock was no small matter. He stopped almost immediately, almost causing Delphine, who was behind him, to bump into him. The Prime Minister's daughter was stunned. She raised her head to look at him and asked in a low voice, "What's the matter?" "What's wrong?" "I can feel Medisha," Brando replied. "My lord?" Medisha's soft voice was immediately transmitted through their telepathic connection. "Is it really you?" Her voice was full of surprise. "Medisha." Brando was very excited, and he was worried about his subordinates who were left in Rushta. So many things happened after the moonfall, and no one knew what happened to them in the end. "Are you okay? Where are Charles and the others? Why are you here? Weren't you teleported away?" He fired off a barrage of questions in rapid succession. Medisha paused for a moment. She was about to answer. But suddenly, her voice became cold, as if she had turned into the little princess in Chablis. "It's you, Lady Delphian." Brando felt a cold wind blow on his back. Chapter 1279. "I thank you from the bottom of my heart, my lord. Thank you for everything you've done for us." "The same goes for your kindness," Brando replied. He naturally had a good impression of the kind-hearted princess. This nun princess didn't do anything spectacular in history, but everything she did was supported by kindness and justice. History didn't need too many revolutionaries, what it needed were thousands of people like the nun princess. He suddenly remembered something and said to Magadol, "I brought someone with me. You might want to meet him, your highness." Who is it, my lord?" Magadol was stunned. Brando saved her life during the battle in Ampere Seal, so their relationship was closer than his relationship with Princess Griffine. Therefore, she did not feel awkward when talking to him. "It's Mr. Blanc, your grandfather." "What?" Magadol was shocked. Duke Blanc went missing in a shipwreck not long after the Holy War, at least that was what the Antibureau family claimed. It had been at least 60 years since then. Although she was not born when her grandfather went missing, she had at least heard about it. Because the Archduke's death was announced as a missing person, it wasn't that she hadn't thought that he might appear in places like Nine Phoenix, but so many years had passed. Even if he was lost at sea, if he hadn't died, he should have returned long ago. Although the connection between Nine Phoenix and Vaunt was blocked, it wasn't completely unrelated. She knew that her grandfather was a sword saint and would not be hindered by a little distance. Therefore, she only thought about it occasionally and treated it as a fantasy. She did not expect that it would one day become a reality. However, she had never seen her grandfather since she was born. She only knew that her grandfather was the most legendary hero of the Antibureau Principality. She admired her grandfather very much, but she didn't know what to do when she had to face him all of a sudden. "My grandfather? Where is he?" "He's outside. I haven't told him that you're here, so I wanted to ask for your opinion." I will see him at once." "Excuse me, Monsieur le Comte." Princess Magadol apologized to him and was about to rush out. However, she paused for a moment and went back to tidy up her dress to see if there were any wrinkles or omissions. This behavior showed that the princess was at a loss for what to do. But it was understandable. After all, they were blood relatives. Although they hadn't met for decades, they still couldn't part with each other. Moreover, Brando knew very well what it would mean for this small duchy if the old duke returned to Antiburo. It was impossible for Magadol not to be nervous and concerned. Magadol hurried out of the room, leaving Brando and Medicia alone in the narrow stone room. Hippamera then thanked him softly. She was a very contented girl and did not think of how to repay him. After all, Brando was her lord and her master. That was enough for her. Medicia was silent for a moment before she asked, "I never thought that Princess Magadol's grandfather would be here. I heard that he went missing decades ago." "There's more to this than meets the eye. Actually, it's not like what the rumors say. But that's Marshal Blanche's private matter after all," Brando explained. "I understand," Medicia shook her head. "But my lord, do you think that Marshal Blanche knows about Miss Magadol's existence?" Brando was silent. He did not tell Blanche about Magadol in advance because of this reason. Perhaps Magadol herself did not know about the uniqueness of her body. The storm's core in her body was originally the power core of the giant god warrior. Any ordinary person would definitely not be able to carry such a thing in their body. There was no doubt that this princess was not human. Unless she was premeditated by someone, the Antiburo family's role in this was very suspicious. But from Magadol's reaction, the possibility of the former was very slim. And the current Duke of Antiburo would definitely know about his daughter's situation. What about the previous Duke? That was hard to say. Of course, he did not want to pry into other people's privacy. He just did not want to hurt this kind princess. Perhaps not interfering was the best way to protect her. But if the Antiburo family really had ill intentions towards Magadol, then he would have to intervene. Not only was Princess Magadol the best friend of Princess Griffine, she was also the best friend of all Tanajal. During the time she lived in Abes, she had formed deep friendships with almost everyone. Such an outstanding lady, Brando would never let her get hurt, and Medicia naturally would not. Brando was silent for a moment, then suddenly took out the angel's heart bottle and shook it in front of the silver elf princess. "I heard that you were injured too. Medicia, do you need this?" Medicia was extremely intelligent. She could see through Brendel's guilty conscience and couldn't help but laugh out loud. She covered her mouth with the back of her hand and said, "There's no need for that. This is a miraculous artifact. My lord, please don't use it as a tool to please girls." "I don't have such thoughts, I'm just worried about my subordinates." The silver elf princess snorted softly. "Actually, I have always suspected that the relationship between Miss Delphian and my lord is not that simple." "Ahem," she raised her head and looked at him carefully. "Actually, I know what Miss Delphian is thinking. That's why I said that she was a little pitiful. But my lord, since you have promised her, don't let a girl be sad and disappointed. Perhaps Miss Delphian made the right choice this time, and only you can save her. Medicia? Don't treat me like a child, my lord. I have 1,000 years of experience, much more than my lord." "No," Brando replied. "I met your sister. In the elemental frontier." Magadol and Frank's reunion was not as complicated as Brando had imagined. The moment the princess saw the old marshal, she recognized the face of the solemn portrait hanging in the middle of the castle. She recognized the old duke who had been missing for more than 50 years. On the other hand, although Frank subconsciously felt a sense of familiarity with the girl who ran out, he did not recognize her at first sight. This was understandable. After all, when he left Antoinette, Magadol was not even born yet. He had not even seen the nun princess when she was still a baby girl, so how could he recognize his granddaughter at first sight? However, what happened next was predictable. When Magadol revealed her identity, the old marshal was overjoyed. Some traditions in a large noble family could not be faked, especially for the people in the family. Besides, Brando had no reason to lie to him about this matter, so Frank believed Magadol's words almost immediately. The old marshal had left Wone for a few decades because of his cynicism, but this did not mean that he did not care about his family. It was a bond that no one could give up, not to mention the glorious bloodline that had been passed down. Magadol immediately threw herself into her grandfather's arms and burst into tears. Although she did not suffer much after the battle in Ampere Seal, now that she was tens of thousands of miles away from her hometown and in a completely unfamiliar environment, it was understandable that she could not control her emotions when she suddenly saw a legendary family member. Frank was greatly relieved, comforting his granddaughter in a soft voice while chuckling. Obviously, he was very happy to meet a descendant who was related to him by blood before returning to the land of Vaunt. However, after a short reunion, the old marshal went to find Brando in private and said, "Young Master Brando, there's something I have to tell you. I might even need your help." "Please don't call me young master. Mr. Frank, if you need anything, please let me know. If there's anything I can help with, I'll do my best. Brendel felt that the way he addressed Frank made him feel uncomfortable. The old marshal sighed. It's about Magadol. Brando was slightly taken aback. However, a hint of understanding flashed through his mind. But when he saw Frank's expression, he ruled out the possibility that the Antibureau family was plotting something. Frank obviously knew about Magadol's background, but it seemed that this was something that he could not do anything about. When this thought flashed through his mind, it naturally showed on his face. Frank looked at his expression and seemed to have understood something. Young Master Brando, you already know? Brendel paused for a moment, then nodded. So, he asked, what's the matter with Princess Magadol? That child, Frank sighed and said, she's an ancient, a descendant of the ancient celestials that is even older than the golden folk. What did you say? Magadol is a divine citizen? Brendel's jaw dropped to the ground. Magadol is a divine citizen? A celestial? Frank shook his head and said, No, that child Magadol is not a celestial. You should have heard of the origin of the golden folk, Mr. Brando. Brando suppressed the shock in his heart and nodded again. Chapter 1280. Brando soon saw Medicia. Although Delphian took the initiative to apologize to her and explain clearly why she was here, the latter still looked a little unhappy when she saw her. To be exact, it was a little cold. Even Brando did not get a good look from the Silver Elf Princess for the first time. Medicia looked very serious, pursed her lips, and snorted softly to express her dissatisfaction. She didn't argue with him. Instead, she turned around and lifted the curtain, walking into the cave. Brando smiled bitterly. He certainly knew that Medicia was angry with him because of the Roman, but Delphian gave him a push from behind. He understood and hurried in. Lady White Fog was lying on the stove taking a nap. She narrowed her eyes and looked at the two of them mischievously. Young people these days, she thought. Medicia, how is Hippamera? The Silver Elf Princess raised her eyes to look at him. After all, she still could not bear to have a cold war with her lord. The day when Brando saved her was still in her heart, how could she forget? Seeing that Brando immediately came in, the anger in the girl's heart dissipated by half. She frowned slightly and shook her head. Not very good, we lack medicine and treatment here. She is badly injured, and Sopalach is a city of the undead. There is only the Temple of the Dying Moon. Lady White Fog sent the pirates to find the Water of Life, but unfortunately they found nothing. Fortunately, Miss Magadol has some knowledge of potions, and with the herb Hippamera she got better. What about Flora, Nightsong and the others? Don't the elementalists have healing spells? I can't summon Flora and the others because I can't contact you, and the Planeswalker's authority can't be activated. Lady White Fog has some healing methods, but it is very limited. Hippamera was a priest herself, but she could not use Himalad's divine power when she was seriously injured. The so-called doctor does not treat himself, it was probably so helpless. In the end, Medicia added softly, if my lord came a day later, I was going to risk going to Elm Harbor to see. Brando could not help but feel ashamed. But the lost names on the sea? I can't just watch Hippamera suffer, my lord and Mr. the Shire, Andrique and her brother, we are like a family, you are like my brothers and sisters. Hippamera is strong, but I can't stand it. Medicia bit her lower lip, her eyes. Brando suddenly understood where her complaints came from. He reached out and wiped the girl's eyes. It's all right now that I'm here. Take me to Hippamela, he answered softly. The Silver Elf Princess replied softly. Miss Delphian? That was a misunderstanding, Medicia, but now she is one of us, at least she won't have any other thoughts. Although I hope she can see her heart clearly earlier and stop being so paranoid, but for now this is the best result. In fact, Miss Delphian is also very pitiful, I understand, I will try to get along with her. Thank you, Medicia. I should be the one thanking you. It was Lord Medisa who gave me a new life, but in order to let Lord Medisa pay more attention to me, I couldn't help but be willful, but Lord Medisa always accommodates me. Medisa is really blessed. Brando's heart softened slightly when he heard this, and he could not help but look carefully at the Silver Elf Princess. Smart, excellent, beautiful, she had everything a young girl dreamed of, like a perfect masterpiece of Martha. The key was that it was so reassuring, like a quiet harbor that could anchor one's heart. Whenever he was with her, Brando would feel a kind of eternal peace, as if all the anxiety and worry had disappeared without a trace. This seemed to be a characteristic of the elves. It is really a blessing to be able to meet you. Brando could not help but say this in his heart. Medisa silently led the way. Sometimes she didn't need to argue, and it was enough to let the Lord understand her intentions. She knew that she was very different from Scarlet, but she would never give up what belonged to her to someone else. When Brando saw Hipamera, he understood why Medisha was so anxious. Hipamera was wrapped in bandages and there were blood stains on them. Some of them were bright red, indicating that the blood had not dried for long. She was lying on the bed, her weak body deeply buried in the pillow. There was no trace of blood on her face, as if only a pair of lively eyes were filled with the color of hope. The moment he opened the curtain and entered, Hipamera's gaze fell on him. "My lord." Miss Priestess seemed to be happy, and her happy tone was exactly the same as Medisha's, which made Brando feel even more ashamed. Even though he had been worried about Medisa and the rest on his way north from Rosaline, he had put himself in their shoes and thought about the consequences of his rash decision back at Rushta. Although he did not regret going to see the Roman, he could understand why Medisha hated Delphians so much. The cave was filled with the pungent smell of medicine. Princess Magadol was dressed like a maid in Greek mythology, and there was a pot of medicine in front of her. When she saw Brando enter, her expression was full of hope. Obviously, he had left the impression that he was omnipotent, as if as long as he was here, Hipamera would undoubtedly recover. This trust was without reason, but it was incomparably firm. "Thank you, Miss Magadol." Brando already knew that the princess was teleported here together with Lady White Fog. These days she had helped Medisha and Lady White Fog a lot. If not for her, Hipamera's condition would have been worse. After all, Medisha was also heavily injured in the disaster. It was said that when she was teleported, something descended on Rushta, and the turbulence in space was affected. That was why she was thrown here. And Lady White Fog was obviously better at killing people than saving people. From Medisha, Brando also knew that Andrique and Mephistopheles might not have returned to Erewhon. Only the Fireclaw Lizardman Lord and Vahina might not have been affected. Because of Hipamera's current condition, he was very worried about the vampire siblings. Princess Magadol quickly shook her head. "Mr. Brando, let's not talk about this. Quickly help Miss Hipamera, her condition is very bad." Brando couldn't help but feel a pain in his heart. He saw Hipamera lying on the bed sheet in front of her, and an open book on her knees. It looked like a travel book about the 9 Phoenix and there were even engravings on it, but the quality was very poor. Miss Magadol's hobby was to read all kinds of books, especially travel books. But he didn't know where this book came from, and there were even missing pages. Her pale and thin hands were placed on the pages, and she tilted her head to look at him, with an optimistic and satisfied smile on her face. At the side of her bed there was a water tank and there were a few prawns in it. It seemed to be the source of her happiness. Although she was a warrior priestess, she didn't like to fight. Her biggest wish was to travel around and see the gifts that Mother Earth had given to this world. But because of her duty, her freedom was restricted, and Hipamera could only look for her dream world from books. She opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but Brando covered her forehead with his hand, motioning her not to move. He took out the bottle of Angel's Heart. Although Hofwold's golden wine also had healing properties, he was already traumatized by it, and would not take it out under normal circumstances. "Open your mouth." Hipamera was very obedient. Everyone's eyes were focused on his actions. Brando opened the milky white bottle, and dripped a drop of the liquid that looked like pure gold on Hipamera's tongue. It was like a miracle, and in just a moment the girl's face became rosy, and her originally dry skin was filled with moisture again, becoming moist and healthy. Her withered grayish-golden hair became bright again, like silk made of pure gold, and draped over her neck. Hipamera let out a cry of surprise and sat up on the bed. The blanket immediately slid down her chest, revealing the bandages that barely covered her body. Brando felt his nose heat up and quickly turned his head away. The girl was stunned and shyly pulled up the blanket, her face a little hot. Medisha looked at the two of them in annoyance. "Martha above, is this the legendary holy water number 1? Princess Magadol didn't care too much and stood up from her seat in shock. She was a devout believer, and naturally had heard of the legendary holy item of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. But Brando shook his head and replied, "This is not holy water number 1, this is the bottle of Angel's Heart, the miracle of the holy archangel sacrificing herself to stay in the world forever." The bottle of Angel's Heart. Medisha looked at the holy item in Brando's hand in surprise. "That is a legendary holy item, my lord, you actually got it." Although Princess Magadol had never heard of this holy item, it didn't stop her from understanding the miracle that happened just now. The fact that Miss Hipamera, who was almost taken away by the Grim Reaper, was now sitting on the bed with a radiant face was the best proof. "You always have a way," She squatted down slightly and sincerely bowed to Brando. All of us were at our wits' end, but you always brought us hope, to my best friend Griffin and to me. Whether it was in Ampere Seal, Lone Harbor, or now, you were always able to lead us out of our predicament. Chapter 1281. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, my lord. Thank you for everything you've done for us. The same goes for your kindness, Brando replied. He naturally had a good impression of this kind-hearted princess. This nun princess didn't do anything spectacular in history, but everything she did was supported by kindness and justice. History didn't need too many revolutionaries, what it needed were thousands of people like this nun princess. He suddenly thought of something and said to Magadol, I brought someone with me. You might want to meet him, your highness. Who is it, my lord? Magadol was stunned. Brendel had saved her life during the battle in Ampere Seal, so their relationship was closer than the one between her and Princess Griffin, which was why she did not feel awkward when speaking to him. It's Mr. Brando, your grandfather. What? Magadol was shocked. Duke Brando had disappeared in a shipwreck not long after the Holy War, at least that was what the Antibureau family claimed. It had been at least 60 years since then. Although she was not born when her grandfather went missing, she had at least heard about it. Because the Archduke's death was announced as a missing person, it wasn't that she didn't think that the other party might appear in places like Nine Phoenix, but so many years had passed, even if he was lost at sea, if he didn't die, he should have returned long ago. Although the connection between Nine Phoenix and Vaunt was blocked, it wasn't completely unrelated. She knew that her grandfather was a sword saint, and would not be hindered by a little distance. Therefore she only thought about it occasionally and treated it as a fantasy. She did not expect it to become reality one day. However, she had never seen her grandfather since she was born. She only knew that her grandfather was the most legendary hero of the Antibureau Principality. She admired her grandfather very much, but she didn't know what to do when she had to face him all of a sudden. My grandfather? Where is he? He's outside. I haven't told him that you're here, so I wanted to ask for your opinion. I'll go see him right away. I'm sorry, Count. Princess Magadol apologized to him and was about to rush out. However, she paused for a moment and went back to tidy up her dress to see if there were any wrinkles or omissions. This behavior showed that she was at a loss for what to do. But it was understandable. After all, they were blood relatives. Although they had not seen each other for decades, they still could not let go. And Brando knew very well that if the old Duke returned to the Antibureau Principality, it would mean a lot to the Antibureau Principality. It was impossible for Magadol not to be worried. Magadol hurriedly left Brando and Medicia in the narrow stone house. Pamela thanked him softly. She was a girl who was content with what she had and had a big heart. She didn't think about how to repay him because he was her lord and her master, and that was enough. Medicia was silent for a moment before she asked, I never thought that Princess Magadol's grandfather would be here. I heard that he went missing decades ago. There's more to this than meets the eye. In fact, it's not like what the rumors say. But after all, it's Marshal Blanche's private matter. Brando explained. I understand, Medicia shook her head. But my lord, do you think that Marshal Blanche knows about Miss Magadol's existence? Brando was silent. He did not tell Blanche about Magadol in advance because of this reason. Magadol herself might not know about the uniqueness of her body. The heart of the giant dragon in her body was originally the power core of the giant god soldier. Any ordinary person would definitely not be able to carry such a thing in their body. There was no doubt that this princess was not human. Unless she was premeditated by someone, the Antibureau family's role in this was very suspicious. But from Magadol's reaction, the possibility of the former was very slim. And the current Duke of Antibureau would definitely know about his daughter's situation. What about the previous Duke? That was hard to say. Of course, he did not want to pry into other people's privacy. He just did not want to hurt this kind princess. Perhaps not interfering was the best way to protect her. But if the Antibureau family really had bad intentions towards Magadol, then he would have to intervene. Not only was Princess Magadol the best friend of Princess Griffin, she was also the best friend of all Tanajal. During the time she lived in Abes, she had formed deep friendships with almost everyone. Such an outstanding lady, Brando would never let her get hurt, and Medicia naturally would not. Brando was silent for a moment, then suddenly took out the angel's heart bottle and shook it in front of the silver elf princess. I heard that you were also injured. Medicia, do you need this? Medicia was extremely intelligent. She could see through Brendel's guilty conscience and couldn't help but laugh out loud. She covered her mouth with the back of her hand and said, There's no need for that. This is a miraculous artifact. My lord, please don't use it as a tool to please girls. I don't have such thoughts, I'm just worried about my subordinates, the silver elf princess snorted softly. Actually, I've always suspected that the relationship between Miss Delphian and my lord is not that simple. Ahem, she raised her head and looked at him carefully. Actually, I know what Miss Delphian is thinking. That's why I said that she was a little pitiful. But my lord, since you promised her, don't let a girl be sad and disappointed. Perhaps Miss Delphian made the right choice this time, and only you can save her. Medisha? Don't treat me like a child, my lord. I have 1,000 years of experience, much more than my lord. No, Brando replied. I met your sister. In the elemental frontier. Magadol and Frank's reunion was not as complicated as Brando had imagined. The moment the princess saw the old marshal, she recognized the face of the solemn portrait hanging in the middle of the castle. She recognized the old duke who had been missing for more than 50 years. On the other hand, although Frank subconsciously felt a sense of familiarity with the girl who ran out, he did not recognize her at first glance. This was understandable. After all, when he left Antiburo, Magadol was not even born yet. He did not even get to see the nun princess when she was still a baby girl. How could he recognize his granddaughter at a glance? However, what happened next was predictable. When Magadol revealed her identity, the old marshal could not help but be overjoyed. Some traditions in a large noble family could not be faked, especially for the people in the family. Besides, Brando had no reason to lie to him about this matter, so Frank believed Magadol's words almost immediately. The old marshal had left Wone for a few decades because of his cynicism, but this did not mean that he did not care about his family. It was a bond that no one could give up, not to mention the glorious bloodline that had been passed down. Magadol immediately threw herself into her grandfather's arms and burst into tears. Ever since the Battle of Ampere Seal, she had not suffered much. But now that she was tens of thousands of miles away from her hometown and in a completely unfamiliar environment, it was understandable that she would lose control of her emotions when she suddenly saw her legendary relative. Frank was greatly relieved, comforting his granddaughter in a soft voice while chuckling. Obviously, he was very happy to meet a descendant who was related to him by blood before returning to the land of Vaunt. However, after a short reunion, the old marshal went to find Brando in private and said, "Young Master Brando, there is something I have to tell you. I might even need your help." "Please don't call me young master." Brando only felt that this form of address made him feel uncomfortable. "Mr. Frank, if you have anything to tell me, I will do my best to help." The old marshal sighed. "It's about Magadol." Brando was slightly stunned. However, a trace of understanding flashed in his heart. He thought to himself as expected. But looking at Frank's expression, he ruled out the possibility that the Antiburo family was plotting something. Frank obviously knew about Magadol's background, but it seemed that this was something that he could not do anything about. This thought flashed through his mind and naturally, it showed on his face. Frank looked at his expression and seemed to have understood something. "Young Master Brando, you already know?" Brendel paused for a moment, then nodded. "So," he asked, "what's the matter with Princess Magadol?" "That child," Frank sighed. "She probably does not belong to our era, but is a descendant of the ancient celestial race that is even older than the Golden Folk." "What did you say? Magadol is a divine citizen?" Brendel's jaw dropped to the ground. "Magadol is a divine citizen? A celestial?" Frank shook his head. No, that child Magadol is not a celestial. You should have heard of the origins of the Golden Folk, Mr. Brando. I think Magadol is a celestial." Brendel suppressed the shock in his heart and nodded again. Chapter 1282. Not only did Brando understand the Golden Folk, he knew them far better than Brando had imagined. The Golden Folk had the blood of warriors flowing through their veins. This was not a joke because they were born to fight, and the Golden Folk themselves often saw it as a kind of glory. They were the warriors of the gods. The gods created the Golden People in order to fight against the Dusk. Compared to the Silver People who were more like scholars than warriors, the Silver Elves were the best at fighting, and they were also the guardians of many rituals and culture. The Golden People were the main counterattack force in the world of order during the Age of Glory. However, the gods created the Golden Folk with the intention of creating a race with the power of the gods, but with a large number of people so that they could fight against the equally large Twilight Army. This process was not done overnight. Over the long years, the gods had made many attempts, but quality and quantity always seemed to be difficult to balance. Before the appearance of the mature and powerful Golden Folk such as the dragons, the gods had many ideas, and some of the species born in between were actually not the golden folk. It was not until the gods finally found a way to solve the problem, creating the Myrna people who were not powerful, but had the greatest potential of all the golden folk. Before they came up with the mortal plan, the number of their failed works in the long river of history far exceeded the number of their successful works. But some of them were not worthless. And these beings who were born before the golden folk were not the golden folk but the ancient folk. Some of them were even more powerful than the golden folk, and their strength was no less than that of the gods. For example, the famous demon infant Sodria in the history of Vaunt, the nightmare of the gods, had even killed a divine folk. Some of them were not powerful, and there were even some who did not have the slightest bit of power, and were called the ancient folk. But most of these ancient folk were annihilated in history. After all, before the stars fell, there was no land for mortals to live in Woned. But there were still some who survived. In Brando's knowledge of history, there were traces of them in Woned as well, though they were few in number and not powerful. These weak ancient survivors mostly lived in the Broken Sword Mountain range north of the Temple of the Earth. Coincidentally, all of the truly powerful ancient citizens, including Sodria, had perished without exception. Instead, it was the lowly mortals who had survived. Even though their living conditions were bleak, at least they had stubbornly survived. Sometimes, Brando even suspected that the gods had found inspiration in this matter and created the Myrnas. They even abandoned the plan of the Golden Race and started the Age of Black Iron. These were crystalline life forms that looked like crystal clusters. Some were pure energy life forms and some were elemental life forms. Others looked more like constructs such as the Krus men. Their bodies were made of metal and they fed on iron. They looked like life forms, but they were very different from the Golden Race and the Silver Race. They also did not fit in with the Black Iron Race. Speaking of which, Princess Magadol was indeed very similar to them. She had a heartbeat, blood circulation and even metabolism. She had emotions, intelligence, and her appearance was almost the same as a human's. Even she did not doubt this. But she was not human. Sometimes Brando wondered if he was human. He had a system that no one else could see, and he had high authority in Martha's divine council. He also had the heart of the storm in his body that was similar to the heart of the dragon. But there was one thing he was sure of. He and Brando's parents were the purest humans. Even Darius, the sword saint, was born and raised in Erewhon. He did not even have the slightest trace of the noble elven bloodline that the nobles were proud of. To be more precise, he was a typical country bumpkin. And before the heart of the dragon was implanted, his body was also purely human. From his appearance to his internal organs to his bones, there was not a trace of abnormality. Even before the orb of nature perfected his bloodline, the blood that flowed in his body was what the Silver Queen called the dirty red blood. But Magadol was completely different. This princess could be said to only be human on the surface. Perhaps she had the emotions and intelligence of a human, as well as a sense of identity. But her body was indeed a construct. Such a strange life form could only have been the work of a mad wizard who was arrogant enough to challenge the realm of the gods. But the wizards, including the Bugas, could never solve the problem of the soul and emotion, and they did not even go as far as their fellow necromancers in this regard. Although the poor liches of Madara still did not understand the principles of their spells, it was hard to say if they were more pitiful than the Bugas. So when Blanche said that Princess Magadol was an ancient, Brando could accept it. But what made Brando a little surprised was how the Antiburo family knew about this. In his opinion, this small duchy, which drifted away from the upper circle of the Kurlutz people, was once very dutiful in history. Although there were some trivial and melodramatic things, they were not out of the scope of ordinary nobles. And how did they come to be related to Magadol? If the princess was really from the ancient era, then how did they come to be related to her? He was familiar with the Golden Race because he knew too much about them in both his previous and current lives. Especially in this life, because of his grandfather, he learned many secrets from the Bugas, from the Silver Queen and many other people that he had never known before. That was how he learned about the plan of the gods, and learned about the Dark Dragon and everything that happened in the past. And in fact, for many people living in this land in this era, including the nobles, the only thing they knew about the Golden Race was the dragons, just like how many people only knew that the Bugas were silver wizards, and they did not even know about the silver elves. To be able to say that the Golden Race was created by the divine people, and even to be able to confirm the existence of the divine people was a very remarkable thing in itself, and that was at least the domain of a senior scholar. And to know the difference between the ancient race and the Golden Race was even rarer. Brando looked at Blanche, hoping that the marshal could give him a satisfactory answer. "You know the origin of the Golden Race?" Blanche was more surprised than him. "I understand the Bugas told you." After all, they had some connections with your grandfather. That's right, you know about the divine people. That makes things easier. The old marshal sighed. In fact, the Antibureau family already knew about the existence of the divine people before that incident happened. Brando knew that the so-called incident was the incident that happened on the final battlefield 60 years ago. Although the marshal did not personally experience it, he should have been involved in the aftermath. He did not open his mouth to speak, nor did he deny the misunderstanding. Brendel knew that the marshal would have a lot to say next. Sure enough, Blanche continued with a sigh. The Antibureau family knew the secret behind this because of Magadol. Marshal, so you should have recognized Magadol long ago? Brando suddenly realized this. Blanche laughed bitterly. I could only pretend that way, Master Brando. You should understand that we had no other choice. That child is actually very sensitive, and I don't want her to realize that she is different from others. No matter what, she is still a kind child and should not be hurt because of this. Brando suddenly understood, and he could not help but sigh in his heart. Although the marshal usually looked serious in front of him, he was actually an Oscar-level actor. Not to mention Magadol, even he did not have the slightest suspicion at that time. Life is like a drama and it all depends on acting. But you can't hide it forever. Lies cannot protect people and will only hurt her more, Marshal. Brando's ears twitched slightly, and he suddenly heard light footsteps coming from afar. It was not Medicia's footsteps, and it was obviously not Delphian's either. Brando instantly knew whose footsteps it was. He subconsciously wanted to remind the marshal, but after thinking about it, he swallowed his words. Since she came here quietly, it meant that she might have doubts in her heart. It was not important when this suspicion arose. What was important was that concealing it could be done with good intentions, but deliberate deception may cause an irreparable rift between the Antibureau family and Magadol. We have no other choice. This is related to another secret. I will tell you slowly later, Master Brando. After saying this, Blanche's face suddenly changed. It was obvious that he had also heard the footsteps. Although his strength was slightly inferior to Brando's, Magadol was just an ordinary person. It was impossible for her to hide in front of two Supreme Realm experts. But Brando said, Marshal, if you can recognize Magadol, it means that she is definitely not your granddaughter, right? Blanche was slightly taken aback and he looked at Brando with some confusion. But Brando shook his head at him sternly. This marshal had lived an illustrious life, and had experienced countless storms and waves. It was obvious that he was not completely ignorant of the human heart. In fact, it was the opposite. With his sharp mind, he instantly understood what Brando meant. Chapter 1283. After hesitating for a moment, Blanche sighed and said, Yes, Magadol was actually discovered by my grandfather. What? Brando was shocked. He thought that Magadol might be from the same generation as the current patriarch of the Antibureau family, but he did not expect her to be from the same generation as the marshal in front of him. At the same time, he heard the sound of footsteps in his ears. You're right, young Master Brando. I grew up with Magadol. Blanche smiled bitterly. At that time, very few people knew the secret behind Magadol, including me. Everyone thought that she was my sister. Then, something happened. Blanche slowly recounted the story that happened nearly 100 years ago. About 4 generations ago, the Duke of Antibureau discovered Magadol in a special experience. Realizing that the girl was extraordinary, he brought Magadol back to the duchy and told her story to a few people, strictly ordering them to keep it a secret. Among these people was Blanche's father, and the little girl was designated to him as his daughter. As Blanche described, he took out an item from his pocket. Brando saw that it was a piece of rusty metal about the size of a palm, and it seemed to be painted. The old marshal rubbed the piece of metal affectionately as he spoke. He looked at the piece of metal carefully before handing it over. We confirmed that Magadol was an ancient because of this. I should have left it to my useless son, but I left in a hurry. I was worried that it would bring trouble to Magadol, so I took it with me. Brando took the piece of metal and glanced at it. He frowned. To be exact, it was an ordinary piece of metal. It was very thin, only a few millimeters thick. It was a little bent and covered with a layer of red rust. But the rust could not hide the paint that was painted on it. It was a layer of blue paint with a white border. There was a line of small letters engraved on it. Umsots Ruptaslames X 00432408 RU 433W. 1044 Stem 25th. No matter how he looked at it, there seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary. But Brando knew that this thing should not exist in this world. It was a production nameplate. He was very familiar with the words on it. It was at least an ancient language from a few years ago. After seeing it many times, he gradually learned how to read it. Although he could not understand it word by word, he could at least roughly understand the meaning of the nameplate. Experimental subject number X00432408 was located in sequence 433. It was located in a production workshop or laboratory called RTU. In short, it had a similar meaning. Finally, there was time. It was a method that he had never heard of before. It was a method that might have lasted for more than 1,000 years. So what was this? He looked at the small piece of metal in his hand, and his heart was filled with questions. A transmigrator like himself? From Earth? Or from another time and space? Or was it a gadget that the planeswalkers brought from a parallel dimension? He raised his head and looked at Blanche. He knew that the marshal would definitely give him an explanation. This is something that was found with Magadol. Brando heard the sound of something falling to the ground. He turned to look in that direction and the sound immediately disappeared. Frank was also looking in that direction worriedly, but he continued, "To be exact, my grandfather found Magadol in a huge metal container in the Broken Sword Mountains. At that time he could not get the entire container out, but he found a baby girl in it. In order to prove it, he tore off this nameplate from the container. Do you know what this is?" Brando asked. Frank shook his head. "We only know that it is an ancient language. My grandfather looked up a lot of information and documents about this. Since then, we have learned about the relationship between the Golden Race and the Divine People. It was also at that time that the Antibureau family began to approach the Holy Cathedral of Fire to investigate Magadol's background." "What about that place, the place where you found Magadol?" "It disappeared." "Disappeared?" "My grandfather and my father went there later, but before that there was an earthquake in the Broken Sword Mountains. That place was originally the hive area of Georgandy Ridge, but it was buried because of it." Brando pursed his lips. His heart was pounding. There was a very interesting fact. Almost all of the ancient people devoutly believed in Mother Earth Gaia because they believed that they came from the same place. That place was buried in the mountains, deep in the earth, under layers of silver plains. There was a silver kingdom. Mother Earth Gaia protected every one of her children. Until one day when the children grew up, the gate opened in front of them and everyone came to the earth. This was a scene described in the myths of the ancient people. Their religious ceremonies also repeatedly repeated the scene of them coming out of the mountains, and the witch doctors and priests passed down this history by word of mouth. What was more interesting was that the Rune Dwarves also believed in this legend. Thinking about it carefully, this history was very similar to the one in Odin's memory. Before the destruction of the Rune Dwarven Empire, the entire empire was also searching for the silver plains described in the dream. The Rune Dwarves also believed in the goddess of the earth, Gaia, and they also worshipped Hauran Gaia as a sacred sword. He could not help but suspect that there might be a fortress like Babel in the depths of the earth. Countless years ago, this fortress history might be even more glorious than Babel, and Valhalla was not even worth mentioning in comparison. Valhalla only carried the history of the Golden Race, and the Silver Plains in the dreams of the Rune Dwarves was the homeland of all the ancient people. But if Princess Magadol was also an ancient, then did she also come from this place? Coincidentally, the head of the Antibureau family 2 generations ago, Brando's grandfather, found Magadol in the Broken Sword Mountains. Brando could only think of one thing from the description of the metal container and the nameplate. A petri dish. With Brando's own knowledge, he should not have known this term. But he was very clear that the other soul in his body, which came from Sophie's soul, was telling him the truth. The metal container that contained Magadol in her infant form was a petri dish. The place where it was located was very likely the place called the RTU laboratory on the nameplate. And that place might have been a part of the Silver Plains. Then there was a question. What exactly was the Silver Plains? Why would there be such a thing there? Brando's mind was filled with countless questions and guesses, and every question made him tremble. Thousands of guesses and thoughts seemed to be circling in his mind, and finally, they all turned into a question. Who was it, and what method did they use to create the ancient people? Who were the ancient people? His mind was blank, and at this time the girl hiding in the darkness could not take it anymore. Princess Magadol burst into tears the moment she found out the truth. She covered her mouth and let out a low sob, and stumbled backwards as if she wanted to escape from this place. But in her panic she lost her footing and fell to the ground. When she got up again she even lost one of her shoes. Stop her. Brando reacted, and did not have time to think about the huge suspicion in his heart. He looked deeply at the metal plate in his hand, then turned around and said sternly to Brando. In fact, there was no need for him to remind him, as Brando had already chased after her. When Brando followed, he just happened to see the marshal holding the crying nun princess in his arms, looking up at him silently. "Count? Mr. Brando?" Princess Magadol saw Brando coming over, and her eyes were red, but she quickly wiped away the tears on her cheeks and hurriedly thanked him. "Thank you." She obviously understood that if it were not for Brando, the Antibureau family would not know how long they would have kept it from her. But in this matter she knew that she could not resent the family that raised her. In fact, even now she had never acknowledged herself as a member of the family. Not to mention that Brando, who was now her grandfather, had already told her about this matter. "Miss Magadol, actually, I have also kept it from you. Ever since the Battle of Ampere Seal, Medisha and I have already discovered that you are different from us." Brando shook his head and said to her, "You don't have to blame yourself for this, Mr. Brando. I understand you and I also understand my family." Princess Magadol seemed to have recovered some of her emotions, and she said somewhat dejectedly, "No matter who it is, when faced with this kind of situation, it is difficult to make a choice. You are also trying to protect me." What a kind girl, Brando could not help but think. She always thinks of others first and rarely cares about her own situation. "Actually, this is nothing," he replied, "and it is not scary. The Buga people are also very different from us, but we still live in harmony with them, and we have never thought of them as a different race." Princess Magadol was stunned, and did not quite understand why Brando would suddenly mention this to her. Brando glanced at her and continued, "What I mean is, humans are not the only race in this world. There's nothing strange about that. The key is that your relationship with the Antibureau family doesn't change because you're an elf, dwarf, or any other race. This relationship is something that can't be cut off." Hearing this, Marshal Blanche could not help but nod, and turned to look at Brando gratefully. "But," Princess Magadol looked a little sad, "a person like me, is it really a life? Perhaps I was created by someone else." "Of course, whether you were created by someone else or not, you have feelings and you have a soul. There is no doubt that all of us were created by Lady Martha, right?" Brando thought that it was fortunate that there were gods in this world. Sure enough, after hearing his explanation, Princess Magadol's expression became much better. "Thank you," she replied softly. "Mr. Brando, thank you. But I don't quite understand what is going on between you and Mr. Blanche." Brando asked. "Logically speaking, you should know Mr. Blanche, right?" "Sigh, this is where I need your help, young Master Brando." Marshal Blanche heard this and sighed deeply. "Magadol has always been in danger and has never been an exception. P.S. Yesterday I remembered the heart of the dragon in Magadol's body as the heart of the storm, and forced myself to switch hearts with Brando. I don't know if Brando secretly took advantage of the girl. I am guilty, it is all my fault, and I have already corrected myself." Chapter 1284. In fact, young Master Brando, Magadol's memories have always been in a state of amnesia. Every once in a while she would seal off her past memories. This may be a form of protection because it has something to do with her nemesis. "Nemesis?" Marshal Blanche shook his head and continued, "The only memory I have with Magadol is when my father and grandfather were still alive. At that time she was still my sister. We were still young then, and my father and grandfather did not tell me anything about Magadol's past. But as I grew older, Magadol's appearance seemed to be fixed at the age of 19. We gradually felt that it was a little strange, but at that time, we also thought that Magadol's mother might be an elf, because I always knew that Magadol was my half-sister from a different mother. When I officially became the head of the family, my grandfather had already passed away for 13 years. My father was also getting old. One day he called me to his study room and told me everything about Magadol. At first I was naturally very shocked and I could not even face her. But as time passed I gradually learned to accept everything. I thought, Magadol is my sister, a member of the Antibureau family. I grew up with her and we have countless beautiful memories. These memories between siblings are inseparable, so why should I deny it? After making this decision, I had a long talk with Magadol and told her the truth. My father, who was the previous head of the Antibureau family, agreed with my decision, because we could not hide it from her forever. That should be Magadol's first memory. I remember telling her this secret in the inner courtyard of the Antibureau family's castle. In my memory there was a small garden, and in the flower bed were some purple gentian. This flower was very popular among the nobles at that time, and there were a few bees flying around the white flowers of the pagoda tree. It was afternoon and the sun was very bright. After listening to my words, Magadol was very calm. Magadol's mouth was slightly open, and she was a little lost in thought. She did not have any impression of this memory at all, but she could tell from Blanche's tone and details that his memories of that era must be beautiful and warm, just like the afternoon sun that he described. His tone revealed a sense of familial love and reminiscence, like dust floating under the warm sun. It was faint but full of warmth. Blanche looked at Magadal and his eyes were full of love. As my sister, Magadal was very different from you. She was calm, decisive, and very assertive. The only similarity between you and her was that you both had a pure and flawless heart. The Antibureau family's guild that helped the poor was founded by you, but they always thought she was your grandmother. Ah, no wonder they were so good to me, Magadal exclaimed. The Holy Cathedral of Fire also talked to me about my grandmother a few times, and they also mentioned the Guild of Saint Vienne and my grandmother, but I have no impression of her at all. At that time I felt strange and ashamed and felt that I had lied to them. But I could not deny my grandmother's past. That was something that happened later. When she found out the truth, she appeared less in the duchy. She began to travel to places like Cruz and Erewhon for long periods of time. I know that she was looking for her origins, and my father and I have been very supportive of her. Magadal, if my grandfather and father wanted to know your secret at the beginning, but after so many years of living together, we actually treated you as a member of the Antibureau family. Just like us, you are our family. The nun princess pursed her lips and sniffed gently. Thank you. I have always treated you as my family. Even now that has never changed. Frank smiled with relief but then shook his head. This continued until my father passed away. At that time something happened. After attending the family funeral, she embarked on a journey to Cruz. On the surface she was invited by the Holy Cathedral of Fire to participate in the spring festival, but in reality she was going to the Broken Sword Mountains to look for the place where we found you. This was the third time she went to the Broken Sword Mountains. Because the previous few times were very successful, I did not think too much about it. I only asked a team of family knight to accompany her. In fact, I was already the de facto leader of the Antibureau family at that time, and the burden on my shoulders was very heavy. It was as if there was an endless amount of work to do. As my sister, she was very clear about this. Even before she left, she only met me briefly. But I did not expect that she would be gone for 3 years. The Holy Cathedral believed that she and the entourage of the delegation had disappeared when they were passing through the Sublime Inland Sea. After that, there was no news of her. But only I knew that she did not go missing in the Sublime Inland Sea. She must have met with some trouble in the Broken Sword Mountains. After that, I frequently went to Cruz. In the eyes of outsiders, it was to strengthen the relationship with the Empire, but in fact, it was to find her. Just like that, 3 years later, one night, I still clearly remember the bright moonlight of that night. The silver moonlight shone through the window onto my desk. I had just finished dealing with the dispute between the Wind Elves and the Sacred Guild, blew out the candles, and was about to go back to my room to sleep when my sister appeared in front of me just like that. She was covered in blood and severely injured. She jumped in through the window and grabbed me. She told me in an urgent tone that she was in trouble and that something terrible was chasing after her. At that time, I angrily asked her where she had been these days, and why she didn't contact her family. At the same time, I pulled the bell on the desk to call for help. At that time she looked very scary and I was very worried. When she stopped me and said that she needed my help to hide what happened next, I did not understand what she was talking about at first. Later, I realized that she must have understood a lot of things at that time. She must have gained a lot from her trip to the Broken Sword Mountains, but she did not have the time to tell us. So, I quietly cleaned up the blood in the room and another person cleaned up the traces in the courtyard outside. Then, I hid her in the cellar according to her request. I brought her some medicine but she didn't use it. It wasn't until the morning of the third day that I saw her again. That meeting was also in my study. I was originally feeling uneasy but she quietly snuck in. Her injuries were almost completely healed and she gave me a very strange feeling. That feeling was as if the person in front of me wasn't my sister, but another stranger. Magadal seemed to have understood something. She moved her lips and wanted to say something, but no sound came out. That's the second you. Very few people know about your existence. She sealed most of her memories and this scary thing didn't seem to find her again. But she's a little different from the current you. She still retains some memories of the past. She's naturally close to those who are familiar with her, such as me and my brothers and sisters, Blanche replied. Because of this reason, very few outsiders knew of her existence. She was actually your mother, the rumored sickly lady. We claimed that she married a noble from the White Mountain area. In order to recuperate, she basically lived in seclusion. She died at the age of 33. You could say that she died young, but in fact she lived much longer than that. She had an exclusive laboratory under the castle and a mage tower. In fact, most of the time we did not know what she was doing. That was how it was until you were born. Before you were born, Magadol, the second you left me a letter. In the letter, she explained that she had sealed her memories for the second time. She had created a new identity for herself, which is your current life. In the letter, she had given up on the secret of her past, and only hoped that you could live a peaceful life as a member of the Antibureau family. I heard from Mr. Brando that all these years, you had done everything you could for the Antibureau family. You had won a lot of prestige and power for the family and the empire. Perhaps this was the wish she left behind in your heart. Magadol looked at the old man and opened her mouth, but she did not know what to say for a moment. But Brando shook his head. Call me grandfather. The current you no longer has any connection with the past. Magadol, I followed the request of the second you in the letter and brought you back from the non-existent father of the White Mountain. I allowed you to become a member of the Antibureau family again. From then on, you are Magadol, my granddaughter. Grandfather? The old marshal nodded at her and smiled with relief. The old man raised his head and looked at Brando. Young Master Brando, I am already old. If Magadol was just an ordinary person, I would not make things difficult for you. But I know my son's ability. He may not be stupid, but he is not a smart person either. Chapter 1285. Perhaps the current generation of the Antibureau family can protect Magadol as an ordinary person, but they can't protect the real her. I know that the mystery surrounding her has never dissipated. Perhaps at some point in time that terrifying thing will come back. If possible, I hope you can help the Antibureau family. I may not have been able to help Mr. Darius back then, but I have always been loyal to the Marshal. I hope you can agree to the request of a dying man like me for the sake of my old face. Grandfather? Princess Magadol whispered, You don't have to do this? Brando looked at the two of them and shook his head. Mr. Brando, my grandfather passed away early, but you are still in the prime of your life. I believe that with your abilities, protecting Magadol will not be a problem. But if that day really comes, I will definitely take action. Not because of your request, but because Princess Magadol is also my friend. Mr. Brando, Magadol looked at him gratefully. Thank you. Your grandfather was just as heroic back then, it's exactly the same. The old marshal sighed. It's no longer appropriate for me to return to Antibureau now. Back then I wasn't able to follow the marshal. Now that I'm able to serve his descendants who are just as outstanding, perhaps it's a way to make up for my regrets. Brando was stunned for a moment, then suddenly felt as if he had picked up 5 million gold coins on the street. As the saying goes, every veteran of the war was a precious treasure, and Duke Brando was definitely one of the top veterans. In other words, if the Amber Sword was a pay-to-win game, then this marshal would be the legendary MR card with a plus card, and it would be the best of the best. In the previous world, this card's only regret was that it was not a soft girl. However, Brando did not care about this at the moment. What did it mean to be a former marshal of the Allied forces? Just the title of the White Wolf Sword Saint was enough to smash a hole in the kingdom of Erewhon. It was not that he did not have such thoughts, but no matter what, Brando was still the Grand Duke of the Antibureau Duchy. Not to mention the status of the duchy as the former head of the Antibureau family, he could be said to be an emperor. How could he become a retainer under Brando? Brando's highest wish was to build a good relationship with the Grand Duke, and strengthen the relationship between Erewhon and the Antibureau family. If possible, it could make the two countries advance and retreat together, that would be the best. After all, it was much easier for small countries to work together to fight against the giants. But now he suddenly felt as if a ton of meat pie had fallen from the sky and smashed him half to death. It was as if he had just received a complicated main storyline quest, and the system had immediately given him an unprecedented epic reward. This feeling was not something that could be described as a dance of ecstasy. He quickly said, Mr. Marshal, please don't say that. If you want to come to Erewhon, then I will definitely welcome you. This would be the highest honor for Tonajal. It would not be an exaggeration to say that you bring light to my humble dwelling. Brando looked at Magadol and shook his head with a smile. Brando originally had a lot of questions to ask, whether it was about Magadol, the piece of metal in his hand, or the damn silver planes. But looking at the grandfather and granddaughter, it seemed like they had a lot to talk about. After thinking about it, he felt that it was better for him not to be an eyesore. Moreover, to be able to gain the loyalty of a former deputy marshal of the Allied forces was already a pleasant surprise for him. After all, whether it was Magadol's background or the silver planes, it actually had nothing to do with him. In comparison, if Erewhon had a commander like Brando, even if the latter could not stand in front of the stage due to his identity, it would be enough to hang up the bones of Madara who were invading Erewhon and beat them up. After all, the military force that Madara used to invade Erewhon was actually a new army used by the Kingdom of the Dead Moon to train their soldiers. Whether it was the high-level combat power, the experience of the commanders, or the investment of high-grade soldiers, it was far inferior to the investment of the Kingdom of the Dead Moon on the other fronts. Although there might be a few geniuses, these geniuses had not had the time to mature and were not a concern for the time being. Not to mention that Insursta and Tarkus were still by his side, and it seemed like they did not participate in the Second War of the Black Rose. And from their tone, the brighter genius Greta was also not in Erewhon. Just the Crimson Knight Ladios alone would not be able to support this war. So he bid farewell to Magadol and Brando and returned to the cave where the pirates were hiding. He found Lady White Fog resting by the fire. He could not let the others wait for too long, and it was not safe outside. Lady White Fog in her cat form had obviously heard Brando's footsteps long ago. She rested her face on her paws, and her ears twitched slightly. She opened one of her light blue eyes to look at Brando, and then closed it again. She replied, "Have you finally appeased your little lovers one by one?" "Lady White Fog," Brando said seriously, "can we talk about the fog outside?" "That won't do. The Witch Empress told me to keep a close eye on you. In the blink of an eye, you are out fooling around outside. When the Witch Empress comes back, how am I going to explain it to her?" Lady White Fog replied casually. "Lady White Fog." Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. "All right, I'm just joking with you. Young people, you are so thin-skinned. You have to admit what you have done. Actually, this is not a big deal. That guy who looks serious on the surface has a few little lovers in private." He thought that the Witch Empress did not know. That guy? Of course it's Odin. Brando suddenly felt cold sweat on his back. He wondered if he would be killed after hearing these ancient secrets. He thought that the Dark Dragon and the Witch Empress would not be so calculative with a junior like him. "But I'm also reminding you to be careful. Don't let your backyard catch fire. Mistress of the White Mist. Those are the unnamed ones. Don't tell me you don't recognize them?" Only then did White Fog open her eyes again. She stood up, stretched her two front paws on the ground, waved her tail and replied, "What do you want to know about them?" Brando thought for a moment and replied, "Humans know little about the unnamed ones. Some scholars think that they travel around Wonde in a fixed route. Based on observations from various places, it seems to be the case. The areas where the unnamed ones appear more often form a closed ring around Wonde. It's just that people don't know much about the part of this line that extends into the Great Glacier." He added, "In fact, people don't know much about the Great Glacier itself." However, he did not say that the so-called some scholars' view was actually the general understanding of later generations. However, his memory of the information on the forum had become more and more vague recently. Brando sometimes wondered if he had Alzheimer's disease in advance. However, one thing he at least knew was that until the Year of the Stars, the players knew little about the Great Glacier. It was an area with a higher level than the Nine-Headed Phoenix. After the Battle of the Oblique Forest, until Madara occupied the area east of the Algash Mountains, the players had formed several expeditions before, but they were all wiped out under the extreme weather changes in the Great Glacier. White Fog stretched and licked her paws. "Isn't that all the details? In that case, what else do you want to know?" "That's not what I'm concerned about, Lady White Fog." Brando shook his head. "I'm concerned about how large the area covered by this fog is. I want to avoid it by going deep inland, but I can't make up my mind because I'm not sure if I can succeed, and I don't know how much danger I'll have to take. I wonder if you have any suggestions for me?" "How do you know I do?" "Medisha told me," Brando said bluntly. "She said that you were the one who taught the pirates how to avoid the sea fog during your stay here. It's all thanks to your guidance that you were able to stay here for so long." "It's not the same a few days ago." White Fog shook her head and replied, "To be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that I had no other choice, I would have already brought Medisa and the others away from this place. To anyone staying in the world, fog won't end well. Please don't take my choice as a sign of my confidence." "World fog. It's just a name. Let's not talk about that for now. However, I do have something to tell you about the movements of the unnamed." "I'm all ears, Lady White Fog. This matter may have nothing to do with the fog, but it may have something to do with it. I saw it with my own eyes, but I need further confirmation. As early as a week ago, there was a great battle between the undead and the crystal clusters on the border less than 100 miles south of Sopalach. I happened to be there to witness the battle. I saw the undead retreating to the north, and countless crystal clusters coming from the horizon. At that time, I left the battlefield in the opposite direction of the undead army's retreat. I suspect that the appearance of the unnamed may have something to do with this battle. Because of a legend. A legend? Chapter 1286. The Black Rose of Roman Tua was retreating north. This was the second time Brando had heard similar news in a month, but the situation in the news seemed to be worse. The defeat of the undead at Rosaline seemed to have led to their defeat on the entire front. The battle that Lady Whitefog witnessed a week ago in the south of Sopalach was not too far away. The Crystal Army might have even been stationed in an area near Sopalach. Of course, they might also be heading in the direction of Lubick, because Lady Whitefog said that she and the undead retreated in the opposite direction. If the army of the undead retreated all the way along the southern part of the Sea of the Dead Moon, the Crystal Army might also pursue them in that direction. What legend? He asked. In the era of the Myurnas, some ancient legends mentioned that the lost names marched around Wone to protect the world. How is that possible? This legend is a bit old. It's normal that you haven't heard of it. It has been circulating on the earth for a long time in the era of the Myurnas. Brando, think about it carefully. How did the lost names march around Wone? Brando recalled the route of the lost names and found that whether it was in Erewhon, Cruz or somewhere else, it just separated the Land of Order from the Black Forest. Although there were some places that were not like this, most of those places were territories that humans later opened up, such as the southern part of Erewhon. It's very special. You want to say that the lost names came from the war between the undead and the Crystal Army, Lady Whitefog? The war between the undead and the Crystal Army? Lady Whitefog jumped onto the exhaust pipe of the stove and looked down at him. Brendel, do you know why I'm suddenly talking to you about these irrelevant things? Because I want you to go through this fog and see for yourself the battlefield of this war. Brando was stunned. He did not expect Lady Whitefog to suddenly mention this. Shouldn't they be discussing how to safely avoid the fog? I don't quite understand. He frowned and asked. You will understand. Aren't you curious as to why the Silver Queen is so hysterical? Haven't you been searching for the truth of what happened to your grandfather 60 years ago? Perhaps when you see that scene you will understand. She took 2 elegant steps on the exhaust pipe, curled her tail and said in a unique tone. Since we came to this place I've been thinking about why we came here. We entered the elemental frontier from Rushta. Even if the flow of magic deviated, it shouldn't have sent us out of the world of order, tens of thousands of miles away from Wone. Until I saw that war, I had a thought in my mind. Perhaps there was a will that was hinting something to me. Perhaps it was Lady Tata, the Dragon Queen, the Witch Empress, or perhaps it was an even greater will. But none of this is important. Brando, this thought became extremely clear the moment I saw you. Do you know what that is? Brando looked at her silently. Speaking of this, Lady Whitefog turned around and looked at Brando. The prismatic pupils in her eyes were vertical. I came to this era with a mission. I know everything that happened in that era. But now, very few people are familiar with that history. The sages left many words for the future generations. I think it's time to tell you some of the truth. Brando lowered his head as if he was thinking. Are you serious, Lady Whitefog? He looked up again and asked, You want us to go through that fog? Brando, have I ever lied to you? I understand. I trust you, Lady Whitefog. But what about the others? They have nothing to do with this. Lady Whitefog jumped down from the exhaust pipe and landed lightly on the ground. She looked up at him and said, Do you really think they have nothing to do with this? Brando shut his mouth. Take them all to sea, Brando, Lady Whitefog said. You're not the savior and neither is Odin. He just told me that he understood it too late. Everyone has to learn how to save themselves, but before that, they have to understand what kind of danger they're in. Brando did not expect that he would get such an answer, but there seemed to be no better way. He knew that Lady Whitefog would not lie to him. She was the spirit of an ancient witch from an era ago. No one here knew more about this mysterious knowledge than she did. He could only trust her for now unless he stubbornly found his own way. But Brando was never that kind of person. He thought for a while and decided to follow this path. Lady Whitefog seemed to want to show everyone something. He had some guesses, but everything could only be revealed after he saw it. Subconsciously, he did not want to believe it. Because if all of this was true, then it would be too hopeless. Brando returned to the team with this thought. Insursta and Tarkus had been waiting for a long time, but the thing the undead did not lack the most was time. They had almost an eternity to wait and did not have the worries of mortals. On the other hand, the people on the Phantom Chariot's side were a little anxious. This anxiety did not only come from the uneasy waiting, but also from the fear of an unknown fate. This was especially obvious in the leaders. Fang Qi and the two Phantom Chariot elders did not seem to be afraid, because they knew their situation better. Influenced by them, the servants were more or less performing much better than the sailors. When Brando returned to the team, Insursta had gotten to know Medisha, the little silver elf princess. His attitude was surprisingly good, and he even asked about Medisha's past experiences. However, it was not because the little princess was a rare beauty, but because Medisha's cavemen and tree elf guards fought against Madara at the end of the First War of the Black Rose. Her opponent was the rising star of the Dead Moon Empire. The temporary beauty of humans was so fragile in the eyes of eternity. Even the elves were just bones that rotted slower. However, a good commander knew how to respect an equally good opponent, because only the latter could show the value of their existence. In comparison, beauties like Hippamera and Princess Magadol were much duller in the eyes of Insursta. They were just names or code names and did not attract his attention. On the other hand, Fang Qi was very attentive, but when he saw Brando appear, his face immediately fell, and he obediently hid in a corner. Obviously, the experience in Port Gusel had left a psychological shadow on this proud son of heaven. Brendel ordered everyone to regroup and set off, but he dismissed the pirates under White Mist's command. These people had committed all sorts of crimes and he really did not want to bring them along. He did not immediately execute them because they had helped White Mist a lot in the past few days. However, the pirates did not think that Brando's dismissal of them was an act of abandonment. Instead, it was as if they had been pardoned. Obviously, they did not have a good time under Lady White Mist. White Mist walked out of the cave and looked at the pirates from afar. Her eyes were full of pity. These people did not understand that sometimes freedom was not a good thing. However, becoming a nameless person could be considered a process of atonement for their past sins. From this point of view, it was not a bad thing. She came to Brando's side, and the Prime Minister's daughter, who was standing behind Brando, bent down and picked her up from the ground. She praised, "So elegant." White Mist snorted softly, "Humph, you don't have to deliberately flatter me. I need to find a backer or else Miss Medisha will always want to kill me." "She won't kill you. Don't think of everyone like you." She swore an oath of vengeance. "You asked for it. Doesn't Lady White Mist need a full-time servant?" White Mist sighed, "Do you know how to comb?" "A little. I have a cat at home." "Don't compare me to them, thank you. Don't cause too much trouble for Brando." "Why would I? I'm already his woman. That's one of the problems." The lady's voice replied in a bad mood. The march in the dark lasted for 2 days. It was the morning of the 3rd day when they left the underground caves of the pirates' lair. The size of the underground caves was beyond Brando's expectations. He even suspected that some areas in the depths of the caves might be connected to the beehive. The area of the underground world of Georgindy Ridge was not inferior to Wonde itself. It was normal for it to extend to both sides of the Tawu Strait. Unfortunately, no one could answer this question and it was unlikely for him to verify it. The exit of the underground caves of the pirates' lair was located in a valley. In fact, the pirates rarely used this exit because it was too far away. The path here had not been used for many years, and it was occupied by a nest of giant spiders. Although these things did not cause any trouble for Brando, they frightened the women in the group. Other than Hippamera, even Medisha's face was a little ugly when they left the dark underground. Delphian, an ordinary person, was even paler, as if she was seriously ill. She had recovered from the injuries she suffered in the elemental frontier after becoming a card of fate, but now it was as if time had turned back. Chapter 1287. This situation continued until the end of their journey in the dark underground. At first, Brando had to take on the responsibility of carrying the Prime Minister's daughter forward. Delphian seemed to be grateful for this, but it was not long before her disguise was mercilessly exposed by Medisha. The Silver Elf Princess decisively lightened the burden of her lord and carried Delphian forward. But for some reason, the Prime Minister's daughter's expression seemed to become worse. Brando pretended not to see the open and covert struggle between the little princess and Delphian. When he led everyone out of the valley, he found that the entrance of the cave had been tightly sealed by the vegetation outside. So he had to pull out Odorfice to cut off the vines and pull them apart. Thousands of mottled insects of various colors scattered as if they were fleeing for their lives. The cave was filled with screams again. Only Huanghua bent down, picked up a beetle expressionlessly, and handed it to Hippamera behind her. "Thank you, Huanghua." Hippamera skillfully took out a bottle and put the beetle in. She now had 3 such bottles, 2 of which contained spiders and 1 of which contained her prawns. In short, the other ladies had kept a respectful distance from Miss Priestess and Huanghua. Fang Qi stood behind the ladies with a solemn face. Brando did not look at this scene. After he parted the grass, his face immediately became solemn. White mist jumped down from Insursta's arms. Delphian, the incompetent maid, lost her sense of existence the next day because of the spiders. She walked out of the cave beside Brando's feet. She looked up and squinted her eyes. What both of them saw was a sky full of fog. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The fog from Towery Strait had exceeded everyone's imagination. On the map, they were already in the south of Soporake, in a valley about 100 miles away from the port. However, the visibility in the valley was less than 10 meters. Beyond 10 meters, it was a vast expanse of whiteness. Steep cliffs extended forward in the dense vegetation on both sides, vaguely revealing the outline of a valley. Insursta followed the two of them out. He saw the scene and shrugged and was about to say something. In fact, he had been voicing his opinion along the way. Compared to the taciturn Tarkus, this guy was simply a chatterbox. But Brando knew that this future star of Madara was just distracting him. Tarkus wanted him to go to Somia, and not Deadwater Bay or Manzola. He looked back at Tarkus, and the warning look in his eyes forced him to swallow his words. At this time there was a rustling sound from the grass, and Medisha, Tarkus, and Magadal also came out from behind Insursta. Brendel gestured for them to keep quiet, and then pointed to the front. Everyone saw that in the dense fog in front of them, there was a group of people and horses moving forward. It was a vast expanse of white, like ghosts, moving silently and unsteadily. Even though they were only a dozen meters away, no one turned back to look at them. Everyone suddenly felt the hair on their body stand up, including Insursta and Tarkus. No one in the world did not feel the mystery and fear of the lost names. Brando motioned for the others to return to the cave, and then he took a look at the long line of lost names and followed them back. The situation in the valley could be said to be both unexpected and within his expectations. Otherwise, he would not have insisted on finding the pirates' lair. Marching in the dark was boring, but it helped them a lot. From the area of Sopalach Fjord to the nearby inland area, it was all rugged mountain roads. They could not move faster than the spreading fog, and it was hopeless to think about walking more than 100 miles under these messy things. But he was a little surprised that the fog could spread so quickly inland. He asked the White Fog Lady's advice for insurance, but he did not expect it to be a prophecy. Now it seemed that he really had to consider the possibility of going deep into the fog. What should we do? Insursta saw him coming back, and after a long time he choked out this sentence. Brando shook his head. There were only two possibilities in front of him. The best choice was undoubtedly to go west to the port cities of Deadwater Bay or Manzola, so that they could keep parallel to the direction of the army of the lost names and avoid running into the center of the fog. Then they could also take a ship from Manzola or Deadwater Bay, and it would be convenient for them to go to Erewhon or Phoenix Fire and return to the Green Jade Hill. But there was a huge problem here, that was, they did not know the current situation of Manzola and Deadwater Bay. Had it become the same situation as Gusel and Sopalach there? Was there the same fog on the sea? No one could say for sure. The other way was to go north and enter places like Somia or the Bone Dragon Cliff as Insursta and the others hoped. The former was the hometown of the skeleton Lord Cabias, who he killed in Castle Abes, and was one of Madara's largest territories in the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon. The latter was said to have a bone dragon tomb, but unfortunately because it was a forbidden zone for players, it had always been a rumor. Both of these places were deep in the hinterland of Madara. Insursta and Tarkus originally wanted him to choose this path because it was actually the only way to cross Madara by land. If they took this path, then going to the realm of eternal death would be an inevitable choice. And if he chose to take a ship from Deadwater Bay or Manzola to Erewhon, the other party's plan would obviously be in vain. But now, even Tarkus and Insursta, who were most eager for Brando to choose this path, had to carefully consider whether taking this path would lead them to encounter the army of the lost names, and what would happen after that no one could say for sure. And Brando also knew that if the white fog was not wrong, the crystal clusters seemed to be attacking Madara in this direction. In other words, if he chose this path he might really have to go to the battlefield. Brando opened the map, and Delphian immediately took the turpentine torch from the skeleton soldier beside her, supported herself against the wall, and went over to illuminate the former. Brando looked up at her, and the pale face of the Prime Minister's daughter was covered with fine beads of sweat. He shook his head and felt that Delphian did not have to do this at all, but she seemed to be deliberately trying to torture him. With this thought in mind he looked at the map carefully. Although he did listen to the White Fog Lady's advice, it meant that they had to plunge into the fog without a clue. The White Fog Lady only asked him to see the war between the crystal clusters and the undead, not to let them face the lost names head-on. This was obvious. If they could avoid it, of course it was best to avoid it. Which path? He asked. Somia. It was Delphian who answered him. Brendel raised his head and looked at the Prime Minister's daughter. From her light purple eyes, he could tell what she was thinking. She still had not given up on that thing, the mystery of the emerald, even under such circumstances. Although he always knew that the other party was almost unreasonable in her bigotry, the resolute answer of the Prime Minister's daughter still gave him a different kind of shock. In a sense, this could be said to be madness, but it also had a different kind of charm. Is it in that place? This time it was Medisha who spoke. The little silver elf princess stared at Delphian with her silver eyes. Her serious expression was the same as when she argued with the Prime Minister's daughter in Rushta. In this world, other than his own life, Brando had never hidden anything from 4 people, and that was the Roman, Allium Japonicum, Medisha, and Amandina. The former fled with him from Bucci, and was the first woman he saw when he came to this world. She had always been the most tolerant of him, and her position in his heart was even higher than his mother in this world. In this aspect, the war goddess' position in Brando's heart was slightly inferior. Although they had gone through thick and thin together, Brando's impression of Freya was more of a pity. He did not want the war goddess of Erewhon to walk down the same path again in the future, and this was very similar to his hope for Princess Griffine. Although he could feel the feelings from the girl in Bucci, and also understood her trust in him, Freya was too serious and resolute, and some things were not suitable for him to say to her. Just like how he felt about Erewhon, the princess and the royal faction, he did not tell her everything. As for Allium Japonicum, there was no need to say much. In this world, perhaps the only person who understood him the most was the female knight from the Grey Mountain, and the other soul in her body. The latter had always been the commander of his subordinates, and Amandina could be said to be his most trusted aide. Since the establishment of Abes, most of his plans were carried out by the 2 of them, so he would not hide any details of his plans from the 2 ladies. Therefore he had also told Medisha about the mystery of the Emerald Heart early in the morning, and this matter was related to a small episode that he regretted a lot. That was when he told Medisha about the details of the Emerald Heart. He accidentally let the latter beat around the bush and told her that he was tricked into bed by Delphian with Hofward's golden wine. Brando could swear that he never thought that the Silver Elf Princess would have so many thoughts, and he thought that she was just asking a routine question. In the end, he did not even know what he had said, but Medisha had already guessed the whole story thoroughly. In fact, he had already begun to suspect that Medisa and her sister weren't half-sisters at all. Instead, they were a pair of biological sisters. Chapter 1288. I promise, Delphian replied, I won't miscalculate. I believe you, but do you understand the cost of deceiving me and the Lord? Medisha replied. Delphian glanced at the spear in the Silver Elf Princess' hand, then looked up into her mercury-like eyes. Threats are meaningless to me, Miss Medisha. What the Lord needs is my wholehearted loyalty. She deliberately emphasized wholeheartedly. Medisha blushed slightly. She turned around and rolled her eyes at Brando. Brando suddenly felt a little baffled. Insursta and Tarkus pretended that they did not hear him. Even though they knew that Brendel was determined to infiltrate Madara's territory and probably had some sort of plan, they were both cautious and intelligent people, and naturally knew how to protect themselves. As for Fang Qi and the other 2 Phantom Chariot elders, Brando and Medisha naturally used crews when they talked, so they could not understand. After the plan was set, the next step was to put it into action. Insursta and Tarkus had no objections to this. After all, they were still prisoners in name, but in fact, this team was decided by Brando most of the time. As Brando's student, Phoenix Fire was even less likely to object. As for the Phantom Chariot gang, they were the captives of the captives. The 2 elders and Fang Qi had no right to speak in this team. At most, they could add in the opinions of Medisha and Lady White Fog, but Lady White Fog usually did not have any opinions, so if Medisha agreed to something, it would most likely be the final result. However, the Silver Elf Princess did not recklessly let the team go immediately. Adhering to the natural meticulousness and rigor of the Silver Elves, she arranged the departure time after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun was at its brightest on both sides of the Tawu Strait, and when the fog was at its thinnest. Brando knew that the power of the war slate was at its peak during this period, and the power of order that shrouded both sides of the strait was at its most stable. Perhaps it was because of Medisha's meticulousness, or because of good luck, they did not encounter any trouble along the way. They arrived at Tormlo at 10 o'clock in the evening of the first day, which was the place where Exion and Phoenix Fire had stopped. If that piece of broken wall was really Tormello's. This was once the most prosperous town on the Black Road between Rosaline and Sopa Latch, but now it was a scene of devastation. A war seemed to have swept through this place not long ago, leaving behind only ruins. The battlefield was full of corpses of the Crystal Cluster monsters and humans. The Crystal Cluster had erected a forest of crystal spears in the middle of the ruins of the town, and the spears were densely packed with human corpses. It was like a bloody and terrifying slaughterhouse, and it was nauseating. Princess Magadal immediately turned her head and vomited, but the rest of the ladies, including Hippamera and Phoenix Fire, were very calm. Brando was a little surprised by his student's reaction. He could feel the anger in her heart, but it was not fear or fear. Aliens. She squeezed out 2 words from between her teeth. That night, Medisha arranged for the whole team to set up camp near Tormlo. Although they could not accept it psychologically, they understood that it was the best choice. The Crystal Cluster monsters were not interested in occupying the town, so it was probably the safest choice to stay in a town that they had already swept through. However, at the end of the day when they were doing a head count, Brando and Medisha realized that a few of the Ghost Chariot sailors were missing. These people had sneaked away or disappeared for some other reason. Brando could not guess and could only ask Delphian to think of a way to keep a closer watch on these people. The Prime Minister's daughter was quite talented in this aspect, and she quickly passed this job to the skeletons of Madara and the Ghost Chariot sailors. Before the sky was completely dark, she had already arranged everything in an orderly manner. Her method was very simple. She just had to sit together and supervise each other, plus some small tricks. Classic methods were often simple and practical because they were often tested by time. The flickering light of the bonfire soon lit up the dark wilderness. The stars and the moon in the sky could not be seen in the fog. The fog surged in the darkness, revealing its shape at the edge of the bonfire, making it even more eerie and terrifying. After a simple dinner, Brando called Huang Hua to him. He decided to teach his new student something for the first time. He did not know how long Huang Hua would be able to learn from him. After all, she would eventually return to the Nine Phoenix. He could only try his best to help her find the most suitable path for herself in the limited time he had. The bonfire lit up Huang Hua's dark eyes. She was dressed in a neat training suit, holding her sword. She came to Brando and bowed respectfully as a disciple of the Nine Phoenix. Teacher, Miss Medisha. Medisha stood behind Brando and looked at the little girl. She also liked the Lord's new student very much, perhaps because she saw her own shadow in her. Brando also looked at his student. Except for Petit Finus, his 2 students in this world shared some excellent characteristics: seriousness and respect for teachers. This was a very good era. Everyone understood the importance of knowledge and inheritance, so they cherished every hard-won opportunity. Even people like Haruz and Huang Hua, who were of noble birth, valued teachers like Brando more. It was definitely not easy to gain the favor of a sword saint, even for the royal family. However, Huang Hua and Haruz were different. Although Haruz was a boy, he did not have the strong aura of Huang Hua. Therefore he was not suitable to be a swordsman at all. A mage was his best choice. As for Huang Hua, Brando knew at first glance that this little girl would be his successor. He even had a premonition that one day the battle style that he inherited from the players would be passed down by this little girl. That was the style of a top warrior. Brando knew that he was never the top warrior. Perhaps one day Huang Hua would go further than him on this path. But that was a matter for a long time. Right now, even a genius had to take one step at a time. Huang Hua, have you ever used a weapon other than a sword? No, teacher. Then I'll let Medisha test your limits first. Is that okay? Yes, teacher. The battle between Huang Hua and Medisha ended quickly. After the battle with Rushta, the Silver Elf Princess's speed of improvement was somewhat beyond Brando's expectations. Although she was cautious and held back, Brando could see that her strength had reached the peak of the law realm. However, Medisha did not use the power of the law to suppress Huang Hua. She knew what her lord was thinking. She used the simplest battle technique to force Huang Hua to abandon her sword. This was purely a difference in battle experience. The Silver Elves had hundreds of years of battle experience in the War of the Holy Saints. In addition, as the commander of the Elven Imperial Guard, Medisha's combat ability was not inferior to Brando's. In terms of battle experience, no one under Brando, including Brando, could surpass the 2 of them. Huang Hua looked at her sword in a daze. Although she already knew the difference between her and Brando, she did not expect the elven girl beside her teacher to be so powerful. In terms of appearance, Medisha did not seem much older than her. She suddenly felt a little disappointed. Although she wasn't discouraged, her confidence was shaken by the fact that she had fallen from the clouds from her usual self-perception of being a genius. Brendel furrowed his brows. He could see that Huang He was a bit distracted. Otherwise, even if Medisha could defeat her, it would not be so easy. As a teacher, he had always been straightforward. What's wrong? Are you not focused enough? Huang He immediately looked regretful. I'm sorry, teacher. Brando waved his hand and said solemnly, everyone has a bad time. I'm not blaming you, but you have to adjust your mentality. Do you understand? Don't be too discouraged. Medisha looks only a bit older than you, but she's an elf. Her situation is a bit special. At your age, she's already experienced hundreds of battles. I understand, teacher. Huang He replied respectfully. Brando turned his head and looked at Medisha. He did not let Medisha fight with Huang He to hurt his student's confidence. He was not that shallow. Moreover, he knew how outstanding his student was. She would not be arrogant because of her talent. Medisha met her lord's gaze. She hesitated and said, Huang He is not suitable to use a sword. It's not that she's restricted by the sword. It's that the sword is restricting her. The sword is restricting me? Huang He was taken aback. She looked up at Medisha and her teacher. It was rare for her to be in a daze. She was a bit cute. To be exact, it's the things you learned that are restricting you. I heard from the Lord that the sword of Hellfire Red Lotus that you practice is one of the best sword techniques in the 9 Phoenixes. However, because this sword technique is too outstanding, it's restricting your imagination and talent. The more powerful a sword technique is, the more the person who learns it will rely on it. I know some of the secret sword techniques of the Silver Elves. The descendants who practice it are often worse than the previous generation. Those who are extremely talented are often burdened by the inheritance and cannot open up their own path. That's the situation, Medisha answered seriously. Chapter 1289. Brando looked at Medisha and couldn't help but chuckle. In terms of battle techniques, he really couldn't compare to this little princess. The path of a player was actually unorthodox because the system provided convenience for the players. Players only needed to find their own style through battle. However, in terms of more formal inheritance and battle knowledge, he was at most an amateur compared to Medisha, who was trained in the forbidden grounds of the Silver Elves. In fact, it was precisely because of this that he had considered teaching Huang He after meeting Medisa. He wanted to avoid misleading her. When old Marshal Frank heard Medisha's words, he was so shocked that he almost jumped up. You are a Silver Elf? Magadal was shocked and quickly pulled her grandfather back, afraid that he would be too agitated and lose the dignity of the Antibureau family. I am a Silver Elf, Mr. Frank. However, I no longer have any contact with the Silver Elves. I am the retainer of the Lord, and the captain of his guards. Medisha answered politely. The old marshal couldn't help but look at Brando with admiration. The Silver Elves were once the staunchest allies of the humans. They were also the guardians of the kingdom of Erewhon. However, because of the dispute between the House of Covardo and the House of Cipher, the Silver Elves left behind in Erewhon no longer interfered with the internal affairs of the kingdom. I never thought that I would be able to see you again in my lifetime. That is because our Lord is outstanding enough. The Silver Elves made an agreement with King Gatl because we believe that King Gatl is an indomitable and trustworthy hero. It is the same for our Lord. Brando was a little embarrassed. Medisha, you are exaggerating. How can I be compared to the Flame King? The Silver Elf princess only smiled. The Flame King has also gained the recognition of Odorfice. Brando was speechless. He suddenly appeared, and this little princess was at least 10 times better than Kargleis and Odom when it came to flattery. However, Huang He seemed to be in deep thought after hearing Medisha's words. Just as the former said, she practiced the Red Lotus Sword of the 9 Phoenixes' 3 great swords. She was also proud of being a member of the Jade Phoenix family. She wanted to become a true powerhouse so that she could live up to her reputation of being a genius and the supreme swordsmanship that she learned. However, Medisha's words were like a bolt of lightning that pierced her heart. The situation she described was very similar to the history of the Jade Phoenix. Many generations of geniuses, but none of them were as talented as the 9 Phoenixes' ancestors. They were all bound to this supreme swordsmanship, and they had never thought of surpassing the realm of this swordsmanship. Of swordsman's level. Medisha looked at the little girl who stood there frowning, as if she had fallen into her own world. She turned around and said to Brando, Huang He is very talented. She has not gone down the wrong path. She just has not thought of her own path yet. It would be easier if she was in our family. I can ask the elders to use the Transcendence Key to release her power and let her know the path that is most suitable for her. There is such a thing in the Silver Elves? Medisha nodded. Brando was suddenly a little envious. The Silver Folk were indeed the Silver Folk. The Bugas also had their own way of cultivating their younger generation of wizards. Their wizard apprentices could be said to be the best in the world, and their success rate was very high. The reason was that the Bugas had something called the White Tower. The White Tower of the Bugas was not only a world-famous library, but it was also similar to the White Tower in the law realm. It allowed people to personally comprehend the power of the law from above. This was because they could have such an experience under elemental energy. Compared to the bitter human wizard apprentices, the Bugas' path as a wizard was naturally much smoother and happier. As a fighting race of the Silver Folk, the Silver Elves naturally had something similar. This kind of sacred object that could let people release their power was even more incredible than the White Tower. What was releasing power? It was actually the process of releasing one's instincts and combat intuition. In his past life, the players had to wait until the middle to late Second Era, when they used the war slate to simulate and perfect the body's law before they gradually began to come into contact with this field. Before that, almost all the warrior players used this ability passively. This led to some people having high talent and some people having low talent. Brendel was a middle to upper class warrior, and in terms of using his intuition to fight, he was actually far inferior to those who stood at the top of the player world. However, once this thing was mastered, it would become the body's most instinctive memory and even integrate into the soul. The reason why Brando was so clear about this was because this wealth from the previous world had been of great help to him ever since he transmigrated to this world. This was the so-called combat experience. Most warriors, before exploring their own talent and power, did not understand what was the most suitable fighting style for them. Just like Huang Hua at this moment, but her talent was also outstanding. She could actually understand her own shortcomings from Brando's fighting style. This was in fact the reason why Brando wanted to make this little girl his student. I have an idea. Brando thought for a while and replied, but I need your help, Medisha. My lord, please tell me. The way we humans release power is different from you. The power of a warrior is dominated by rage and wildness, so we believe that when a person fights based on instinct, he will be able to find the most suitable fighting style for himself. Guide anger? Medisha was a little surprised. Humans have mastered such a brilliant method in the past 1,000 years? This requires a considerable understanding of the law and the soul, right? She subconsciously looked at Brando. Brando immediately knew that things were not going well. The old marshal frowned. In fact, the human world did not have such a method. Before the Year of the Sparks, there was only one way for human warriors to train their fighting instincts, and that was to repeatedly fight. Brando, like Brando, naturally had unparalleled fighting instincts and experience after hundreds of battles. However, this method was actually quite backward. It had existed since the beginning of mortals learning to fight, and could be said to be the fighting style of beasts. Until the Third Holy War, humans still relied on this primitive method. Fortunately, the old marshal had been away from Wonde for half a century, and he was not sure if the Holy Cathedral of Fire or the other major holy cathedrals had come up with new methods in the past few decades. He only frowned and did not express any opinions. This gave Brando a chance to cover up his lie. His method was, of course, summed up by this system. In fact, it was also a method that existed in the Amber Sword for the convenience of the players. This method was shown in the game as a quest called Guide Anger. It was similar to the Elemental Activation quest, but only warriors could receive it. The process of completing this quest was the process of guiding anger. The chain of quests was done very well, and even received praise from the players at the time. However, Brando still felt a little strange when he thought about it. He always felt that he had learned something in the chain of quests. Otherwise, he would not have been able to directly apply his combat experience in the game after transmigrating. Of course, this was not what he needed to think about now, but how to simulate the method in the game. In fact, since he had spoken, he already had a plan in mind. Fortunately, in this world he also had the system. So he continued to say to Medisha, talk to Huang Hua first. She's a little uneasy today. I think it has something to do with those monsters. Ask her what's going on. My method was actually developed by the Highland Knight. It's not mature enough, I have to prepare. Medisha glanced at him, and the look in her eyes made Brando feel that he had been exposed. However, since Medisha did not speak, he naturally would not admit anything and could only keep his mouth shut. I understand, my lord. Then I'll leave it to you. You can practice more with Huang Hua and find out where her limits are. I have high hopes for her. She might become the future sage of the Nine Phoenix. Is the sage coming again? Medisha heard this and was slightly surprised. Maybe in Wonde, a new sage has been born. After handing Huang Hua to Medisha, Brando left the camp alone. This did not mean that he was irresponsible, but teaching Huang Hua was not something that could be done overnight. Although he tried to save time, it was not something that could be done in a day or two. In terms of expertise, it was better to leave it to the Silver Elf Princess. As for the things that he knew, it would not be too late to slowly teach them to Huang Hua after she found her own path. This was not something that could be rushed. For now, letting Medisha and Huang Hua familiarize themselves with each other was a good thing for both sides. After all, in his mind, the Silver Elf Princess had to take on half of the responsibility of a teacher. He quickly buried this question in the depths of his thoughts and began to think about the next step in the dark. With this thought in mind, he subconsciously walked toward another bonfire in front of him. The two bonfires were quite a distance away from each other in the darkness, and it was so dark that he could not even see his own fingers in front of him. When he approached the bonfire, he stopped in his tracks. He saw Delphian sitting beside the tent. The bonfire made her face red. The daughter of the Prime Minister buried her head in writing and drawing, as if she was calculating something. Brando paused for a moment and then silently walked over. Chapter 1290. Delphian seemed to be so focused that she didn't even notice Brando walking up to her. Brando looked at the Prime Minister's daughter's slender neck that was exposed because she was burying her head in her work. There was a layer of fine hair on it that reflected the light of the bonfire. She held a charcoal pencil and drew a map in her diary. Speaking of which, this Prime Minister's daughter was worthy of her status as a noble lady. Her art skills were quite outstanding. Not only was she good at sketching and oil painting, she even knew how to carve and have some understanding of murals. She could write poetry and was very accomplished in literature. She was also very talented in music and religion. It was said that she had joined the Holy Cathedral Choir when she was a girl and was deeply admired by Vala. But such a person's heart was so stubborn that it was almost twisted. Brendel could only sigh at the fact that there was no perfect person in this world, or perhaps it was because she pursued perfection too much that she left behind such a flaw. He stood quietly behind her and didn't say anything. He knew that Delphian had long noticed his arrival. He didn't deliberately hide his presence. This Prime Minister's daughter never relaxed her vigilance of her surroundings. She was a woman as sensitive as a cat. Speaking of which, the diary in Delphian's hand was returned to her by him. The charcoal pencil in her hand paused on the page of the diary. I thought my lord would scare me behind my back. Unfortunately, I was already prepared to show a panicked expression. Do I have such a bad taste? This is a taste, my lord. You really don't understand a girl's heart at all. Brando stared at Delphian. He really couldn't see where in her heart a girl's heart was. It was more likely that she was full of schemes. Who would really dare to treat her as an ignorant girl? That was really the side of Goddess Elaine that represented misfortune. He looked at the map Delphian drew in the diary. Are you still calculating that? I have to make sure that nothing goes wrong, my dear lord. Delphine held the diary with both hands and exhaled softly at the open pages, blowing away all the charcoal ash and bread crumbs on it. She closed the diary, then moved away from the blanket she was sitting on. She patted the blanket and motioned for Brando to sit over. Brando looked at her and sat down. He really did have something to say to this woman. Do you still remember what you said last time? Did I say that I wanted to be your woman? Delphian looked at him charmingly. Do you have any physical needs that you want me to help you with, my lord? Brando almost choked. He knew that she was definitely doing it on purpose. This woman was very flirtatious in front of him. Let's be serious. Is this not serious enough? Delphian playfully leaned over and mischievously breathed into his ear. With a hoarse voice, she rubbed her throat and said, You don't have any children yet, my lord. Although I can't help you give birth, your little elven princess is looking over here. Do you want me to help you teach her something? Brando was so scared that he subconsciously looked back. But other than the bonfire in the darkness that looked like starlight, he could see nothing. The Prime Minister's daughter couldn't help but laugh so hard that she was swaying back and forth. Tears even fell from her eyes. So cute, my lord. She sighed. Brando's face was so dark that it looked like it was going to drip water. Delphian laughed so hard that it looked like she was going to roll on the blanket. Brando waited for her to finish laughing. The Prime Minister's daughter's face was flushed. She looked at him a little embarrassedly and stuck out her tongue. I haven't been this happy in a while, my lord. You're happy. Why are you angry? Not yet. Brando felt Delphian's head leaning on his shoulder. A hint of fragrance came from her hair. Last time, you didn't mention the specific location mentioned in the jadeite riddle because you said you were still guessing. Today you asked us to go to Somia. Did you find something? It's a little interesting. Delphian answered in a low voice like an obedient little girl. The jadeite riddle uses the Sinilch riddle to transmit information. This is an ancient encryption method. Legend has it that it came from the riddle of the Sinilch riddle, the golden folk who live on the golden hill. Each line has 16 words, and the number of lines must be a multiple of 7. The relationship between words and lines is the first level of the riddle. How to read it is contained in the riddle. But to solve this riddle, you need to be familiar with the meaning of the Sinilch riddle. This is the second level of the riddle. The final answer to the riddle is how to arrange and combine the answers to each riddle. This is the third level of the riddle. As long as you get any one of them wrong, the final answer you get will be very different. Brando had a headache just listening to her, but he didn't know why the Prime Minister's daughter suddenly mentioned this to him. He knew the Sinilch riddle. They lived in a country called the Golden Hill. The golden folk were especially fond of guessing riddles. It was said that the bronze dragons were related to them. Their nostalgia for riddles remained in their blood and was passed down from generation to generation. However, the Sinilch riddle was destroyed in the era before the Golden Hill. Their inheritance had long been lost. No one could even find the location of the Golden Hill. Delphian leaned on him and continued, "This encryption method has existed for a long time. I have only seen it in some ancient books. It's no wonder that Chariot and the others don't know this riddle. My lord, do you know about the Ranisa ruins?" Brando thought for a moment before remembering that place. The discovery of the Ranisa ruins was quite famous. The person who discovered it was a countess named Ranisa. She discovered the ancient ruins in her own territory. At first, it was even said that it was the ruins of the Babel fortress, but in the end it was found that it was not. However, the prehistoric civilization in the ruins was not inferior to Valhalla at all. The only difference was that Valhalla still existed, but the ruins were already gone. He nodded. The scholar in charge of the excavation of the ruins was Master Abbot. He invited me to be his assistant. Wait, he invited you? My other identity is an honorary member of the crew's Royal Geographical and Historical Society. How about it? My lord, do you feel that you have gained my favor? Of course not. Brando thought, what does this have to do with the Jade Riddle? Of course it has something to do with it. When the Ranisa ruins were excavated, we found that the words engraved on the metal tablets were also encrypted using the Sinilch riddle method. Think about it. The two places thousands of miles apart have different cultures, inheritances, customs, and languages. But in a certain era in history they showed amazing consistency. Brando faintly felt something that he couldn't grasp flashing through his mind. He frowned and asked, what does that mean? It means that it's very interesting, isn't it? My lord's orb of nature is called the Orb of Nature in Wand, but in Nine Phoenix, it has the name of the heart of the Azure Dragon. Although the names are very different, in the end they are the same thing. Some things run through our history like an invisible hand manipulating our fate. Those mercenaries are Rubik people. Brando certainly knew that Adney and the others were Rubik people. The knights did not hide their belief in God Ra. But what did Delphian mean by that? Did Adney and the others also come for something similar? Perhaps it was possible. Wand had the Azure Lance, Nine Phoenix had the Jade Dragon Sword, so why couldn't Rubik have a similar legend? He suddenly recalled the gray light that he had seen in Rosaline that day, and he suddenly understood why the knights had come looking for him. But he couldn't get that thing out, so he couldn't help but feel a little troubled. You solved the riddle? Yes. Delphian leaned her cheek on his shoulder and replied, My lord, a lot of ancient information in this world has been encrypted in the same way. Some are riddles of Theniel, some are dragon prayers. My understanding of these knowledge is only superficial, but other than me, there are not many people in this world who can solve them. I will definitely make you feel that it's worth it. Don't think of yourself as something that can be bought and sold, Miss Delphian. Being bought and sold means that it has value. I'd rather be a rare commodity than a mediocre person. Brando shook his head. He really couldn't understand this woman's way of thinking. He didn't intend to persuade her. He only asked, Where is it? It's in the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon, deep under the dry sea in the lowlands. At present I can only confirm this much. The Sea of the Dying Moon was a vast inland sea, but in the past, it used to be even more vast. In the past 1,000 years, this inland sea had been shrinking, leaving behind a dry seabed. In the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon, a lowland swamp area was formed. This was the place that Delphian mentioned. This lowland had always been a forbidden area, and it was the same for the undead. It was an area similar to the Black Forest. Although this forest was different, it was also full of danger. Brando nodded. He thought that the answer to the riddle of the jadeite should also be in this area. After an unknown period of time, Delphian seemed to have lost her breath. He turned his head and found that the Prime Minister's daughter had fallen asleep with her head down. She snuggled up to him tightly, her expression was very peaceful, and even her breathing seemed to have become gentle. The diary slipped from her hand, and the charcoal pencil fell to the side. Brando sighed, pulled up the blanket from the ground and covered her. The Prime Minister's daughter seemed to have had a good dream, and her slender eyebrows slightly relaxed. Chapter 1291. Beside the bonfire, Medisha looked at Huang Hua, who had changed into her normal clothes. The bonfire made the face of the princess of the Jade Phoenix clan red. Huang Hua, you have something on your mind, don't you? Huang Hua looked at her in surprise. Is teacher angry? His lordship won't be angry over such a small matter. You don't have to worry. Medisha shook her head. But it's important to stay focused. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. Is it because of what you saw in Tomro? I noticed that you were not in the right mood at that time. Yes, Miss Medisha. Call me sister. Sister Medisha. What's going on? My mother, I understand. Medisha looked at her lovingly. I'm sorry. Huang Hua shook her head. Sooner or later I will take revenge. Medisha suddenly thought of something. She patted Huang Hua's young shoulder. You will. I believe in you. Huang Hua, don't be discouraged. One day your achievements will be higher than all of us. Let's call it a day. I will go and see his lordship. Teacher, I said it's okay. His lordship is not so petty. You are his student. You know this best, right? Huang Hua nodded and bowed solemnly to Medisa. Although the Silver Elf Princess didn't look much older than her, she had learned a lot from Medisa. No matter how she looked at it, she had to thank Medisa sincerely. Medisha smiled and waved at the little girl. She picked up the spear that was leaning on a tree stump and quickly disappeared into the darkness. Sister Medisha is an excellent person like teacher. Huang Hua said to Mr. Willow. I didn't expect there to be such an excellent swordsman other than the nine-headed phoenix, Mississippi. I think the world outside the 9 phoenixes is also very vast. In that place called the Wond, there are also many things that we don't understand. I only understood the meaning of my own experience today. I want to go to Erewhon and take a look at my teacher's hometown, Mr. Liu. After we return to 9 Phoenix? Mr. Liu asked. Yes. Huang Hua nodded. Brendel's hand stopped in the middle of pulling up the blanket. Medisha? He could hear the footsteps of the Silver Elf Princess in the darkness. Medisha came to his side and looked at the Prime Minister's daughter who was sleeping soundly on his body. She sat down beside Brando and asked without turning her head, Do you believe her words, my lord? What about you, Medisha? Brando felt Medisha leaning forward slightly and leaning on his back with Delphian. He suddenly felt a little scared. Medisha? She can, but I can't. I thought you wouldn't fight for a woman's affection? Brando was speechless. Because I also deeply admire you, my lord. From the moment you woke me up from the darkness, my heart and my life were like a nightingale singing softly. It told me who the most important person in my life is. Medisha's voice was low and filled with the unique softness of an elf. She seemed to be narrating a love poem, which made Brando stunned. He understood Medisha's love for him, but he didn't expect it to be so deep. I can concede in front of the Roman and Miss Freya, I can concede in front of Scarlet, and I can even concede in front of Miss Delphian, but she can't. I won't allow myself to lose to Miss Delphian. My lord, do you understand Medisha's heart? Brando turned his head. Medisha was half kneeling, looking at him with eyes like stars. Her eyes were filled with stubbornness and uneasiness. Brando felt as if the softest part of his heart had been hit hard. What other choice did he have? The distance between their eyes was getting closer and closer. Medisha closed her eyes, her eyelashes drooping down like a fan, shyly trembling. I love you, my lord, she said uneasily. Medisha, please answer me seriously, my lord. Yes, you will always be my princess, Medisha. After a long time their lips parted. The Silver Elf Princess's silver eyes were filled with happiness. She hugged Brando's neck tightly, her whole body leaning against him, her soft chest pressing against his back. So this is how Miss Scarlet feels. I really envy her. Why do you say that? Because I also want to be a real person, to be able to accompany my lord. Even now, my heart is full of satisfaction. Thank you, my lord. Brando's heart was heavy. The two of them leaned against each other silently. He didn't know how much time had passed, but he suddenly felt Delphine shiver beside him. He subconsciously thought that the Prime Minister's daughter was pretending to be asleep again. Medisa also seemed to have noticed this. She raised her head and looked at the woman. But Delphian frowned as if she had fallen into a nightmare. She bit her lips, occasionally whispering a few words from her throat. Until the two of them heard her words clearly. "I'm sorry, Elman." Medicia's hand suddenly froze. She looked at Brando. Brando sighed. "That's her fiancé. Does Miss Delphian love him very much?" Brando shook his head. "She loves herself." "But why?" "I don't know, maybe she already knew this in her heart. She wants to be cold-blooded, but she also wants to be able to have true love. Maybe Martha gave her everything, but also gave this lady a conflicted heart." "The heavens are always fair." Medicia opened her mouth but she did not know what to say. She looked at the Prime Minister's daughter with pity. Brando also sighed and gently pulled up the blanket covering her body. 3 days later. A lonely high ground stood in the middle of the fog. Rustling footsteps gradually came from behind the white fog, and a figure gradually emerged from the fog. He stopped on the high ground and looked around. The cold wind blew at his worn collar, and all he could see was a white world. The fog that filled the sky moved slowly in the morning breeze. The fog seemed to be a desolate and uninhabited wilderness. There were a few trees baring their fangs and brandishing their claws in the distance, which was probably the only reference in this white world. There were no villages, no roads, and nothing that could attract attention. Apart from the sound of breathing, it seemed to be a lonely world. "What is this place?" An abrupt voice came from behind. Brendel turned around and, as expected, saw Incersta's face, which looked as if it had not yet woken up. He did not know why an undead always liked to sleep so much. Of course, according to Incersta's own words, it was the pursuit of eternal sleep. But eternal sleep did not seem to be what it meant. Brando shook his head. 3 days ago they left Tormuro, the place where Xian and the others had stayed. Of course, that was if the place where the ruins of the wall were located was really Tormuro. That was the last place they saw with a reference. Then they quickly lost their direction and soon even the road disappeared. The only indicator seemed to be the dim sun in the sky behind the layers of fog. But it was useless. They followed the direction of the sun and were about to reach Somia, but the map seemed to have lost its function. The areas marked on the map that should be the territory of humans or undead did not appear. It seemed that they had entered the lowlands, but the ground was as flat and dry as ever. There were no traces of the battle between the undead and the crystal cluster. It was as if they had entered a completely foreign plane. Xian walked in this area all year round, and Huanghua and Mr. Liu had also walked this road, but none of them could recognize the nearby terrain. No one knew where they were. This situation would be fine if it lasted for a short while, but it lasted for 3 whole days. During these 3 days, everyone was about to collapse from the monotonous scenery in the fog. So it was no wonder that Incersta had such a look on his face. Brando frowned. The situation in front of him was obviously a bit abnormal. Getting lost would not cause such a situation, but thinking that they were now in the fog of the lost names, the current situation seemed a bit normal. "My lord, a few more sailors are missing and Seabass is missing. Xian is going crazy." At this time Medicia came up from behind and reported to him. Although Delphian had made a detailed plan, it did not seem to work. These days the team had been shrinking, and a few people would disappear inexplicably every day. Panic had spread among the ordinary people, but Brando could do nothing about it. This was the fog of the lost names, and the current situation was already the mildest. Suddenly all the people around him disappeared without a trace, and it was not impossible. However, the disappearance of the youth named Seabass still gave him quite a shock. As Na Xian's adopted son, Seabass and Na Xian could be considered as one of their own. They had always been under everyone's protection. For them to disappear under such circumstances, it could only mean that the situation had worsened. Brando turned back and looked at the little princess and the unhappy Delphian. The whole plan was made by her, so she was naturally responsible for the current situation. But in fact, Brando did not intend to blame the Prime Minister's daughter. After all, this was something that humans could not do. Besides, at least Delphian's arrangement allowed them to see clearly a few days earlier that the disappearance of the sailors was not because of someone sneaking away, but because of the fog. He asked, "What's going on?" Chapter 1292. "Sir Count, I promised my old partner to take care of Seabass. I'm still a man, so I have to keep my promise. Now that Seabass has disappeared, I know that this damned fog is very strange. You don't have any obligations, but I want to leave alone and go to the place from yesterday to take a look. Even if I lose my life, I can at least give my old partner an explanation." Na Xian furrowed his brows. Clearly he had already prepared an excuse. When he saw Brando, he immediately said it. He carried a bow on his back and wore the clothes of a smuggler. His head was wrapped in a scarf, and he wore a pair of deerskin boots. A black dagger hung from his waist. "Where is that place?" Brando asked. Seabass said that he saw a forest in the fog. "When I was young, I heard about the legends of those ghosts who had lost their names. I told him not to meddle. Besides, how could there be a forest in the fog? I remember that place. If I went there alone, it would only take me half a day to reach it." "Did he go in?" "No. Seabass disappeared at night. Around 8 or 9 o'clock, he tossed and turned, unable to sleep. He kept talking about the forest to me. He complained that I didn't tell you about the forest. He said that with a reference we might not have to go around in circles in this fog. However, he was still a young man. How could he know? He didn't understand that some things couldn't be said casually. I reprimanded him and told him not to let his imagination run wild and go to sleep, but he didn't agree. When I turned around, there was no trace of him in the tent." Na Xian's throat trembled, revealing a frightened expression. "I was afraid that he would run out alone and do something stupid. At that time, I thought that he had left the tent, but when I chased after him, I only saw his back in the fog. Sir Count, that place was at least 100 yards away from my tent. That child Seabass, I didn't teach him any martial arts. In the blink of an eye, he definitely couldn't have run that far. I desperately called out his name, but he turned a deaf ear to me. I put on my jacket and chased after him, but before I could get close, I felt someone bump into me from behind. When I woke up again, it was already morning." Brando comforted him. "Don't worry, Mr. Xen. We may not necessarily not help you. Seabass has already been missing for a night. Why don't you stay and wait for a while? You're an insider. Who knows, we might need your help later." "But, my lord, it doesn't matter. We're going around in circles in this fog anyway. Seabass might not be wrong. Since someone saw the forest in the fog, it means that it existed before." He turned around and asked, "Did the missing sailors also see the forest?" Delphian nodded. "At least 3 of them mentioned the woods or similar words to others. The situation there is similar to Seabass, but the sailors think that they have been bewitched by the spirits in the fog. You saw it, Mr. Xen?" Brando turned around again and said to Xen, "Now the thing behind the fog has revealed itself. You said that you know the place. Can you take us there?" "My lord? Don't worry, we're now a team. Today it was Seabass, but tomorrow it might be any of us. Instead of wasting time aimlessly here, it's better to grab hold of the clues in front of us. What do you think?" Brando comforted him. Xian was in awe. He bent down and deeply bowed to the Count of Erewhon. Brando turned around and said to Medisha, "Go and tell Insursta to scatter the skeleton soldiers and arrange them into a scouting formation. We'll go back the way we came and search again until we find the forest." The silver elf princess nodded, indicating that she understood. She asked again, "Is there anything else you need, my lord?" Brando thought for a moment and called out to her. "Tell him to divide the skeleton soldiers into small teams. Each team must be equipped with 2 liches, not 1. There must be a mid-level liches in each team. The mid-level liches are only responsible for the communication between the teams. The core of the team is still the low-level liches." This was the most classic military structure in Madara from his previous life, which lasted until the year of the astrology after the Second War of the Black Rose. Its effectiveness was naturally proven by later generations. He did not want to reveal this secret, but then he remembered that it was actually limited by the limited number of mid-level undead in the Undead Moon Empire. Before they found a more effective way to transform the undead, this military structure was not as threatening to Erewhon as a genius general like Insursta himself. But for Insursta and Tarkus, this little secret was priceless. At least a part of the highly efficient undead organization was still available to the new generation of dark nobles supported by traditional forces. "But I hope you won't use this method to let me see it on Erewhon's battlefield. Otherwise you'll be out of luck." Brando looked at Medisha's back and could not help but think in his heart. The reason the undead abandoned this traditional organization method after the year of the astrology was naturally due to its own shortcomings. It was the most efficient and even refreshing way to organize the undead in this era for the Undead Moon Empire. But looking at the past from the perspective of the future, it was not difficult to find the negligence of the predecessors. Teacher is a true gentleman. Huanghua heard what Brando said to Na Xen and could not help but praise Mr. Willow. Even in the Nine Phoenix, it's rare to see such an excellent person. A knight like Mr. Brando is indeed rare, Miss Huanghua. Mr. Willow also expressed his agreement. He sighed and said, "The key is that he's still so young. He seems to have some understanding of the undead organization method. I haven't been to Wone for more than 10 years. I didn't expect to see such a person there. Huang Hua nodded gently. Insursta and Tarkus were naturally people who knew what was good for them. If it was a stubborn old undead lord, Medish's method of arranging the skeleton soldiers might be beneath contempt. Since when was it the turn of an elf to interfere in the affairs of the undead? But the two best partners in Madara's history saw the value of Brando's suggestion at a glance. After Medisha left, the two could not help but look at each other and see the surprise deep in each other's eyes. A noble Count of Erewhon actually knew more about the organization of the undead than the traditional nobles of the Dead Moon. And he could further propose a way to improve it. Both of them were smart. They naturally knew that as an opponent, Brando dared to tell them this method as he was not afraid that they would use it on the battlefield of Erewhon in the future. This at least meant that Brando was not one step ahead of them, but 2 or more steps ahead. Insursta was the first to sigh. This count is getting more and more important in my mind. Old man, if I didn't care before, now I really want him to join us. He will definitely be the brightest star under the Dead Moon. Even Tarek can't compare with him. But this is a stubborn guy. Tarkus, do you have any ideas? Tarkus thought for a moment as if he was seriously considering this question, but in the end he shook his head gently. Unless His Majesty is willing to compromise on the issue of Erewhon. This count seems to have some kind of obsession with that ancient kingdom. You should pay attention to his hostility towards us. He knows very well what we want to do. It's this kind of wisdom that can see the future. Insursta could not help but feel a little helpless. At this time, I actually hope that this count is one of those greedy old men. They can sell anything for profit. They never talk about loyalty and glory, only power and status. Leave it to His Majesty to decide. This count is not as tough as you think. At least in Erewhon, he is not on the same side as the royal faction who supports the royal family. Do you know why he let the prince go? It's because Tanajul doesn't want to stand on the cusp of the storm. If Brando were here to hear Tarkus' words, he would definitely be surprised at this vampire's deep understanding of the situation in Erewhon. But it really had nothing to do with him when the prince was let go. It was the princess' decision. It was only later that he realized that Griffin had done that to protect him. After all, the princess had some political skills. After the skeleton soldiers were sent out according to Brando's method to form a small scout team, it did not take long for news to come back that something had been discovered. To be more precise, they had found a forest. But this forest was somewhat unusual. When Brando rushed there, he saw a forest standing in the fog. But it was a crystal forest. Clusters of crystals grew on the ground, and the soil was completely crystallized, reflecting a bright light. When Nazan walked with him to the crystal forest, she was almost stunned. She muttered, "How is it possible? This is the forest that Seabass saw? Is it here?" Yes. Nazan looked around. "It's here. There's a mound over there. I remember very clearly that we passed by that mound." Seabass said that he saw a forest on the left, but I dare to swear to Lady Martha that when we passed by here yesterday, there was absolutely nothing here. How big is this place? Brando turned around and asked. Insursta sent 2 small groups of skeleton soldiers to the east and west along the periphery of the forest. We still haven't seen the end of it. It's been about a quarter of an hour. Delphian replied. Chapter 1293. The Silver Elf Princess pondered for a moment and immediately estimated the distance. Then there's no need to waste any more time, my lord. A quarter of an hour is enough for the tireless undead to walk a mile. Beyond this range, even if we explore the edge of the forest, it won't be of much use. Brando nodded and said to the Prime Minister's daughter, Delphian, let the skeleton soldiers enter the forest and we'll follow. Keep an eye on the sailors and don't let them act alone. The Prime Minister's daughter nodded. She knew that Brando wanted her to keep an eye on the sailors of the Phantom Chariot not because he was worried about what they could do, but rather because he wanted to protect them. As a noble, her lord was a little too soft-hearted, she couldn't help but think, but she wouldn't say it out loud. The orders were quickly passed down layer by layer. In fact, the emotionless and tireless undead were much more efficient at carrying out orders than intelligent creatures. The factor that originally limited their distance was also eliminated because of the new organization provided by Brendel, and this undead squad seemed to have taken on a new look. This was also the most frightening thing about the forces of the Dead Moon. Their low-level soldiers hardly needed training and were the best professional soldiers. Although they were dull, dullness was not necessarily not an advantage. The sailors were somewhat resistant to entering the crystal forest. Sailors at sea were the most superstitious group of people in this era, because the unpredictable weather easily made them revere nature. They believed that the storms at sea were the wrath of the god of storms, that the fog was produced by the singing of the sirens, and that they believed in sea monsters and almost all mysterious powers. But little did they know that there was no such god as the god of storms in Wonde. The one in charge of the Department of Winds and Storms was the goddess of the North Wind, who had fallen long ago in the last era. However, these gossip did not affect Brando. He knew that the complaints of these sailors represented the views of the people behind them. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the third elder of the Phantom Chariot to find him. He had nothing to say to this guy and only told him, "Let Fang Chi come to me." The third elder was infuriated by Brando's rudeness, but there was nothing he could do. Just as Brando had said, they were in the same boat. Compared to Brando, they were even more clueless about this mysterious fog. "My lord, do you need that person?" Medisha looked doubtfully at the third elder who was walking away. She knew that her lord was not an impolite noble. He must have his reasons for treating these people like this. "Let Delphian tell you," Brando replied. Medisha turned around. Delphian had already lowered her head and whispered in her ear, "It's related to that. Opening the Jadeite mystery requires the blood of the supreme bloodline of the 9 phoenixes. As far as I know, the supreme bloodline of the 9 phoenixes has already split into the Ghost Chariot and the Jade Phoenix. I can't guarantee that Miss Delphian or Fang Chi can open the gate to the stagnation realm." After saying that, she blew a breath into Medisha's pointed ear. The Silver Elf Princess shuddered. She turned around and glared at the woman angrily. While the two were still whispering, Brando had already stopped. He stopped in front of a huge cluster of crystals and looked to the side. While everyone was still wondering what he was looking at, Brando suddenly raised his hand and slashed in that direction. Before anyone could react, the light beside the cluster of crystals was distorted. The spatial ripples caused by Brando's hand hit the spot where the light was distorted. There was a sharp cry, and a strange crystal creature was sent flying. It crashed heavily into the cluster of crystals on the other side. After that cluster of crystals was shattered, it flew back 5 or 6 meters before it landed on the ground. "Strange creature. Crystal cluster." Phoenix Hua and Medisha shouted at the same time. "Wait a minute, I didn't feel its presence at all." The Silver Elf Princess was the first to react. Her silver eyes looked at Brando in surprise. "My lord?" It was as if this thing didn't exist before. It was as if it appeared out of thin air. Brando also reacted. "If it wasn't for you, young Master Brando, even I wouldn't have noticed it." "Those are parallel beasts," Phoenix was said. "They are the eyes and ears of the army of strange creatures. They will hide in the spatial gaps parallel to our world." "Teacher, how did you find them?" Brando shook his head. He could only find them because of his dark perception ability. No matter how well the crystal cluster was hidden, it could not deceive the flow of magic. This was the power of dark perception. Otherwise, he would not have been so excited when he first obtained this attribute. "Follow me." The appearance of the crystal cluster made his premonition come true. He raised his hand and said to the others. But at this time, Delphian suddenly looked at the shining amethyst in her hand. She raised her head and said to Brando, "My lord, Incersta said that the skeleton soldiers on the left wing went out." "What went out?" "It means that they went out of the forest. There is a large plain in front of them. There is no fog there." "How is it possible? How can this forest be so thin? We haven't even walked a mile deep yet." Naexang cried out. "Is this forest in the shape of a belt?" "No." Brando shook his head as if he was not surprised by Delphian's words. "This is not a forest." "This is not a forest?" Brando stepped on the ground. "I have seen this crystallized land before. Medisha, do you remember?" The Silver Elf Princess frowned slightly, but her eyes suddenly lit up. "The deadly frost forest," she shouted in a low voice. While the two of them were talking, a strange sound suddenly came from the sky. The sound was like something passing over their heads, making a whistling sound. This sound quickly turned into a deafening sound. Everyone saw a burning meteor falling from the sky, falling straight into the crystal forest. "Get down." Naexen only had time to give a warning before the air current mixed with countless sharp crystal shards hit her face. Except for Brando and Frank, almost everyone was thrown to the ground. Brando reached out and pulled Delphian into his arms. At the same time, he threw Howran Gaia in front of Hippamera. A gray light screen immediately blocked the shockwave. Frank protected Magadal, Mr. Lu stood in front of Phoenix Flame, and Medisha was able to protect herself. She carefully stood behind Brando, the mistress of the white mist on her shoulder. The roar and the rising clouds lasted for a long time. When Naexang got up from the ground, she felt a burning pain on her face. She touched it with her hand and could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. There were a few cuts on her face and it was full of blood. Fortunately, it was not a serious injury. She looked up and saw that after the smoke dissipated, only Brando, Frank and Medisha were still standing. Besides them, there was also Delphian in Brando's arms. She coughed softly and quietly got out of the latter's arms. "What is that?" Naxen suddenly saw the scene in front of her and could not help but be shocked. The place where the forest used to be had now turned into a large crater. In the depths of the crater, there was a meteor lying there quietly. The meteor was burning with flames, and the mottled surface was falling off, revealing a crystal that was emitting a bright light. Somir crystal. Brando threw a blanket on her head. "Wrap your head. Don't expose the wound. Be careful of the crystallization disease." Although Naxan did not know what the crystallization disease was, at least she knew that Brando would not joke with her at this time. She hurriedly wrapped her face with the blanket, ignoring the tearing pain on her face. Fortunately, she was also a fugitive in the underworld. She could still endure this pain. Brando looked up at this time. Just a moment later, Frank and Medisha also looked up. "Count!" Insursta's shout came from behind, probably because the communication crystal had lost its function. "Something is coming from the sky. I lost a group of skeleton soldiers." As soon as the voice fell, 7 or 8 black shadows had already arrived side by side. They tore through the fog and swept over the heads of Brando and the others. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared on the other side of the fog. Flying monsters. Although it was only for a moment, Phoenix Hua, who was half kneeling on the ground, also saw what those things were. She anxiously shouted in a low voice, "How is it possible? We have never heard of flying monsters. Be careful, there are more behind." Insursta, on the other hand, was hopping mad. He saw the phantom chariot sailors crawling up from the ground, seemingly trying to escape, but there was still a platoon of skeleton soldiers behind them. If they were separated by these people, it would not be good. It was a headache for him to deal with these useless humans who were more of a hindrance than a help. 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows, 4 rows of crystal clusters in a formation pierced through the fog and appeared above everyone's heads. Unlike the crystal clusters that were in charge of scouting earlier, they almost immediately began to hover in the air and then attacked the humans near the Somir crystal below. Phoenix, Hua, Hippamera, and Medisha almost instantly bounced up from the ground, each of them unsheathed their weapons. Frank also took a step back to protect his granddaughter, a long sword in his hand. Brando looked up. He stretched out his hand, and a translucent curtain wall immediately appeared above everyone's heads. Then he pushed it forward and the spatial wall immediately moved forward. The crystal clusters that were diving down had no time to dodge and directly crashed into the wall. There was a continuous sound of glass shattering, and it was as if there was a rain of crystals above everyone's heads. Countless crystal fragments fell and formed a layer on the ground. Chapter 1294. In the eyes of Insursta and the others, the fog above their heads was dispersing layer by layer, as if blown away by the wind, revealing the thick clouds in the sky. A burning meteorite was dragging a long trail across the sky from west to east, blooming with a dazzling light. This light was reflected in everyone's eyes, shining brightly. And in the west there was another one. A third and fourth shining light spots also penetrated the clouds and fell towards the east. They seemed to light up the clouds, turning the bottom of the clouds into a golden red color. "What's that?" someone asked. But no one answered. A scream drowned out everything. Whoosh! Crystal clusters flew over the forest, like a flock of startled birds, covering the sky and the sun. Then there were even larger crystal clusters that flew higher. They formed a curtain wall above the low-flying crystal clusters. Above them there were even more, like a huge swarm of insects. This was the insect hive migrating. The whole sky seemed to be like a flowing purple tide, forming several intertwined turbulences that moved slowly in the sky. However, the slowness was just a visual illusion. The lower they went, the faster the crystal clusters flew. The formation they formed was almost whistling through the sky above the forest. Some even brushed past the treetops, bringing up torrents and blowing the crystal powder all over the sky. A few blind crystal clusters even wanted to attack Brando, but their fates were no better than those before. One by one they crashed into the shining light shield and turned into dust. Everyone began to watch the net-like arc-shaped light shield flicker under the impact of the crystal clusters, as if it would collapse at any time. But this did not happen. It only deformed slightly and then returned to its original state. The crystal clusters crashed into it and broken limbs fell like rain. Later, everyone could not help but feel a little numb. It was as if what crashed into the light shield was not a monster at the peak of gold or at the level of elemental activation, but a net of sparrows. But it was because of this that they were able to watch the spectacular scene in the sky. They stared intently and held their breath for fear of missing a detail. Suddenly there was a squeaking sound in the sky. The crystal clusters screamed together. It was a cheerful cry, as if they were welcoming some kind of existence. Their cries were like countless crystals resonating in the sky, making a sound that made the whole world tremble. To be exact, it was a tsunami of sound that echoed throughout the sky. All of a sudden, a crystal cluster that was so huge that it almost filled the entire sky suddenly appeared from the clouds. The crystal cluster was like a blue whale swimming leisurely in the background of the sky. Its huge body was like a floating mountain range. Its long fins stretched out from both sides, refracting the light of the crystal under the sunlight. Its long tail swept through the clouds, occasionally revealing a glimpse of its beauty, and occasionally disappearing into the clouds. Insursta opened his mouth wide. Jianghu heard the sound of chattering teeth. She turned around and saw that the ghost chariot sailors seemed to have been cursed. They were rooted to the ground, and their eyes were filled with despair as they looked up at the sky. They shivered and almost collapsed to the ground. She furrowed her brows. She believed that warriors should never give up hope under any circumstances. However, on second thought, she realized that these people were not warriors. Silently, she turned her head to look at the sky. Deep in her eyes, she could feel the suffocating pressure from the Titan's silhouette. "That's Leviathan," Medisha exclaimed in disbelief. "No one told me that Leviathan is actually a crystal cluster. In the chaos of the Sea of Magic, there are many things that are beyond our imagination," Brando replied. Delphian's face was pale. Her fingernails almost pierced into her palms. She barely managed to stand still. The nightmarish scene reappeared in front of her. "Are you all right?" Brando turned around and asked her. The Prime Minister's daughter was slightly stunned. She looked at him with her mouth agape. After a while, she reacted and quickly nodded. "I'm going to the front. Do you want to stay here for a while? There won't be any danger in the light barrier." "No." Delphian shook her head firmly. "I know. There's no place safer than the Liege." Brando glanced at her. "Then come with me." He took one last look at the Somir crystal that fell to the ground, and then walked forward without looking back. In front of him was the last border of the crystal forest. The skeleton soldiers passed through there a moment ago and brought back the information that there was a plane ahead. At this moment, he had become the backbone of everyone, including the people of Phantom Chariot. No one jumped out to sing a different tune. When they saw him walking forward, they subconsciously followed behind him. Even the sailors of Phantom Chariot did not fall behind. "Did you see that?" Insursta said to his old partner. Tarkus did not say a word. He only shook his head. "What right does he have to do that?" Elder Phantom Chariot, who was ignored by Brando, roared with his hair and beard standing on end. Beside him, Fang Chi turned around and glanced at him. He raised a finger to his lips. "Shu, we must learn to respect the strong Elder Lonely Mountain." "Fang Chi. He's very strong." Fang Chi looked deeply at Brando's back. "And he wants to talk to me. Miss Delphian knows the secret of the mystery of Jade. Do you understand?" Elder Lonely Mountain's face turned red and white, but he could no longer say anything. Nothing was more important than the mystery of Jade. The scenery behind the forest stretched as far as the eye could see. Only the word endless could describe such a shocking scene. It was a long arc, so long that it was almost impossible to see the end. There was no end to its east and west. There were only undulating faint shadows, like the undulating mountain line hanging on the horizon. It was like a long outline that outlined the boundary between heaven and earth. Under the arc, there was a black land that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was like an expanding surface, stretching and enlarging everything on it. The forest was like an isolated island in the vast sea. It was so small that it set off the vastness of the land. Brando and the others stood at the edge of the isolated island. Everyone was dumbfounded. In front of them, reflected in their eyes, two armies were engaged in a life-and-death battle on this land. The battle cries seemed to be isolated behind a barrier. The moment Brando and the others walked out of the forest, the earth-shattering sound waves swept over like a tide, washing the eardrums of everyone present. The purple waves swept across half of the land. They were countless crystal clusters. Their number could not be described with any human language. On such a vast land, the unfolded battle line could not accommodate all the crystal clusters attacking on the same front. They crowded together and filled all the space, even layer upon layer. Like a marching ant colony, they swallowed everything in their path. Their enemies. Medisha did not recognize them. Delphian also narrowed her eyes and looked at the messy banners with some confusion. But in Insursta and Tarkus's expressions changed. Black bone claws tightly grasped the vines. That was the Phanasa Legion, the first legion of Roman Tuo's Black Rose in the middle of the Sea of Dying Moon. It had participated in the First War of the Black Rose, but it did not fight on the battlefield of Erewhon. Instead, it faced the terrifying Saint-Tassol Legion. The insufferably arrogant Wind Elves also suffered grievances in front of them. Just as their commander, the King of White Mountain, Philip, said, this was a legion forged of steel. Their will was like iron and they were ruthless. But this legion was now almost completely annihilated. A few remaining banners struggled to hold on in the purple waves. In the blink of an eye they were completely submerged. Anyone who had a little understanding of Vaughn's military structure would understand that this legion had disappeared. Its reputation and all its memories of the past had completely disappeared from this land. On this battlefield, the famous legions of the Empire of the Dead Moon were lined up in a row. Brando counted 7 or 8 of them. Any one of them was enough to destroy the small kingdom of Erewhon. The only chance left for the people of Erewhon might be that this rising new empire did not attach importance to the nobles of Erewhon. But now there were other reasons. Brando suddenly remembered that since the Second War of the Black Rose, the Phanasa Legion had never appeared in Madara's battle order. The players of Madara thought that the Withered Claw Lord had lost the political struggle with His Majesty. After his power was removed, he was exiled to the south of the Empire, a forbidden area that the players could not set foot in. But today they were indeed here. But in another way. He raised his head. Above the arc that represented the horizon was the golden-red sky. Under the thick clouds, countless crystal clusters flew out from the forest. Meteorites fell from the clouds one after another. It was like the end of the world. The crystal clusters had already occupied half of the sky. Anyone could see that the undead had to retreat. Where's the bone dragon? Why can't I see the bone dragon? The lazy aura on Insursta's body seemed to have disappeared all of a sudden. He rushed to Brendel's side and cried out involuntarily. There. Delphian pointed at a corner of the battlefield and said to him. On the black ground, the white remains of the bone dragon were scattered all over the ground. A huge monster crawled in the middle of the battlefield like a sleeping giant. Brando recognized this bone dragon. To be precise, he had seen it once in Fortress Reeden. When it flew over at a low altitude, it destroyed the last resistance of Fortress Reeden with its dragons. At that time it was still arrogant, unlike now when it had lost all of its vitality and aura. Bone Dragon Lord Byssos. Chapter 1295. Insursta swayed. This is a decisive battle. The Empire has invested so many troops in the south, but Her Majesty has never told us. What did she say? At least 1/3 of the Empire's military strength is here. Insursta clenched his fist and growled. If these legions are gathered together, what about Fanzan and Cruz? Look over there. Tarkus walked up and pointed in a direction. The flag of the Dead Moon. Madara's future star suddenly felt dizzy. Her Majesty the Emperor. Brando pursed his lips tightly. This was undoubtedly a decisive battle, and Erewhon's greatest enemy, the Empire of the Dead Moon, was about to be defeated in this battle. However, he did not feel a trace of joy in his heart, only a deep fear. He looked at the sea that shone with purple light, and looked at the Somir crystals that fell from the clouds. His heart was cold. Was this a battle between the undead and the crystal cluster? The scale of this battle had already surpassed the Battle of the Oblique Forest in his previous life, and the Cipher War in the Year of the Sparks. Only the battle in the Alkash Mountains before his time travel could be comparable to this. However, the Empire of the Dead Moon, which was so powerful that it seemed to be invincible, actually lost in such a crucial battle. In his eyes, the flags that represented the legions were disappearing in the sea. That represented not only the defeat of the undead, but also the withered petals of the Roman Black Rose. If Madara lost 1/3 of its military strength here, then it was still unknown whether the Empire could maintain itself. Needless to say, would the Crystal Cluster stop their march to the north because of this? It was very difficult to say what was going on. Brando could not help but ask himself. He did not know if the Empire of the Dead Moon had also experienced such a tragic battle in the south in his previous life. At that time, the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon was a forbidden zone for players. His Majesty the Emperor had forbidden any northern nobles from entering the south. Naturally, it was the same for players. No one knew whether the war in the south of the Empire was intense or mild, whether it was a local conflict or an all-out war. Brando could not remember whether the Emperor was in the realm of eternal death when the War of the Black Rose broke out. This was the tragedy of Erewhon. The war in Erewhon did not even attract the attention of the Emperor. This is the war between the world of order and dusk. Brando, no one can stay out of this. White mist jumped down from Medish's shoulder and landed beside his feet, watching this scene. Brando turned around and found that everyone seemed to be under a spell as they stared blankly at this scene. Some of them came from the 9 Phoenixes, which had a powerful empire behind them. Some came from Rubik, which was a desert kingdom. Although it was not as glorious as Kurlutz and Madara, it had a long history. There were also some who came from his territory from the small country of Awin. Other than Medisa, most of them had never seen such a magnificent war in their lives. Although Delphine had witnessed the battle between the Empire and Hazel's army of constructs in the Grey Hills, she had never seen such a magnificent war before. However, that battle took place in the Grey Hills, and the battlefield was less than 10 kilometers wide. Compared to the battle in front of them, it was like a child's play. Even Brando's eyes reflected this battle, and his heart was surging. The Holy War 60 years ago seemed to be reappearing in front of his eyes. The might of the Dead Moon Empire had exceeded everyone's expectations. The 8 massive legions almost made the Kurlutz feel ashamed, not to mention that this was only a third of their total strength. Of course, due to various reasons, the undead had never been able to gather their full strength. The Dark Lords fought with each other. If it were not for the appearance of the Mercury Staff, this powerful and rare kingdom would have almost gone into obscurity forever. However, those who were not involved in it always indulged in the past glory of the Empire, such as Delphine and Brando. They never thought that outside the human world, there was a power that was not inferior to the 4 holy cathedrals in the slightest. That was the Black Rose of the Roman Tua. Except for Brando, no one knew this secret. It was not that they could not understand it, but because arrogance and pride blinded most people's eyes. But now, this powerful enemy was being crushed by an army that was completely unfamiliar to this world. Its enemies seemed to have no intelligence. They only knew how to swarm forward and swallow everything, and then the Empire of the Dead Moon was defeated. It was a complete and utter defeat. Everyone heard the sound of something being broken. It was the countdown of the original order being overturned, and the destruction of the civilized world by the power of disorder and chaos. Adeline seemed to have thought of something, and her face turned pale. Insursta and Tarkus did not say a word. The former was still clenching his fists. Huang Hua bit her lower lip, and Mr. Lu's face was solemn. Brando had a solemn and pensive look. But at this moment, a few spots of light suddenly flashed in the sky, and a few intertwined golden lines extended from nowhere, instantly penetrating the entire battlefield. In the middle of the clouds was Leviathan. When Brando raised his head in shock, the dazzling flames had already exploded in midair in the middle of the battlefield. It was like a flare brighter than the sun. A few roaring fireballs burned fiercely in the sky of the battlefield, and the dazzling light made the light of the entire battlefield dim, as if the day had turned into night in an instant. But the phenomenon only appeared for a moment. The mushroom cloud had risen with endless smoke and dust, and the shock wave pushed the dust cloud forward, rushing into the forest with a whoosh. Then tons of dust and debris swept over. Brando reacted quickly. He stretched out his hand and pushed it forward, opening up a net of spatial laws, blocking all the dust and air waves outside. But even so, the light shield was still bent at a terrible degree, and the impact was far greater than the impact of the crystal clusters on it previously. "What's the matter?" someone shouted in the roar of the explosion. But the noise drowned out his question, and at the same time drowned out the answers of others. But a thought flashed through Brando's mind. Was there a third party on the battlefield? Was it Madara's backup force, or was it an ally of the undead? He looked back at Insursta, but the latter and Tarkus had the same blank look on their faces. They had never seen such an offensive and means before. Was this magic? Brando felt that it was a little familiar. He wondered if the Bugas had participated in the battle. For the Silver Folk, this was very likely because after all, their opponent was the Twilight Dragon. The smoke and dust soon dissipated. Immediately, someone screamed, "Look over there." Brando looked in that direction and saw that the horizon was shrouded in clouds, and a white mist hundreds of feet high rose. In that mist, there seemed to be thousands of troops gathering. Those were the Lost Names. The direction they were in, Brando's heart tightened slightly. He saw rows of Lost Names knights, armed with spears, dressed in armor, and riding war horses made of clouds and mist, coming out of the depths of the mist. They were in formation. The knights of the Lost Names were expressionless and silent. A Lost Names knight in a cloak and a laurel crown on his head rode past the knight on the left and right. He held his long sword high, and the translucent tip of the sword seemed to reflect the light of the sun. "That's King Eric," Blank suddenly shouted in shock. Brando also saw it. It was the Lionheart sword. That scene seemed to overlap with what had happened 1,000 years ago. On the plain, the flags were shining, and the knights wore long helmets and held spears. They lined up against each other, facing the heavy cavalry of the Cruz people. The man in front of them shouted to them, "Erewhon people, my knights, are you afraid?" There was only one answer. "They're here again, your majesty." A pale, slender hand slowly lowered a long staff flowing with silver light. She looked at the battlefield in silence. "Those are our heroes sleeping in the long river of history. The sages have long passed away, but they still protect us. Isaac, do you still think we are the only ones facing this war alone?" "But I don't understand, your majesty, who are they?" The Most High with the Mercury staff opened her mouth slightly and said the name in an almost inaudible voice, "The Earth Legion." Rows of pale white knights were walking out of the clouds. Their spears were raised high like a forest, and the tip of the spear was shining with a dazzling light. In their memories from 1,000 years ago, the only answer lingered in their minds like a ghost. What was the answer? The war horses began to accelerate and trotted on the battlefield. The knights held their heads high and put down the tip of their spears in rows. A white wave appeared on the battlefield. They surged, wrapped in the momentum of thousands of soldiers and horses. These knights' faces were blurred, and their bodies were illusory. Each face represented a distant memory when they were alive. The past, present, and future were intertwined in their eyes. They had no names, lost their nationality, and no longer belonged to any nation or race. Everything in their life, together with their past, seemed to have passed away like smoke. And everything that was left. They only existed for this answer. The defeated left wing of the undead stopped instantly. A blade that emitted the light of Bai Lung appeared on the battlefield. It swept across the vast land and cut diagonally into the purple sea. It collided with a loud bang. At that moment, Brando turned around. "We will also join the war." "My lord, what did you say?" Medisha asked in surprise. "Madara can't lose this war," Brando said to Medisha. "Just like the decisive battle on the Great Plains that humans can't lose, Odin gave us a choice, and now we must give him an answer." This answer had been waiting for 1,000 years. It was a long time. But the four sages finally returned everything to the hands of the people who should decide it. At that moment, Brando suddenly understood the meaning of the Most High Holy. 9. The Hermit. The rusty spring was being reset. Chapter 1296. Brando turned around and looked at the others in the wind that was filled with the smell of gunpowder. Just like Madara, the nine-headed phoenix has fought against monsters for a long time, and we have lost countless of our loved ones. No matter what, teacher, I am willing to fight against them. She took a deep breath and tried her best to calm herself down. She opened her mouth and replied, "Just like Madara, the nine-headed phoenix has also fought against monsters for a long time." Fang Chi walked up. "Count, you want the sacred jade sword back." Brendel saw through his thoughts with a single sentence. "But our strength is insignificant." "It's okay, I need a promise from you." Phantom Chariot is a man of his word. Even if it's about the mystery of the emerald? Fang Chi hesitated for a moment, gritted his teeth and nodded. A green jade sword suddenly appeared in Brando's hand. He turned the tip of the sword and handed it over. "I hope you won't disappoint me, Mr. Fang Chi." Fang Chi's pale hand grasped the hilt of the green jade sword. Quill grabbed Adni's shoulder as she was about to rush up. Adni struggled and shouted anxiously, "This is a chance for him to return the omniscient eye to us." "Quill, what are you doing?" The Elven Ranger looked at her and shook his head silently. "This is not a chance, Adni. Does the omniscient eye really belong to us? But you and I are not its owner. We are just people who carry it. The omniscient eye stayed in the desert kingdom because it chose Lubick. It is the same now. Then what do we do? What about our mission? Have you forgotten the teachings of R.A.? Of course not. That's enough." Quill let go of her shoulder. "Wisdom is the power of silence. We must always see the road ahead and know who our enemies and friends are. Follow him. He is right. Madara cannot lose this war." Adni snorted. She pulled out her sword, turned around, and pointed the bright sword to the sky. "Knights of Ra's wings, no. I mean my colleagues of the Sunflower Mercenary Group, draw your swords and let's go." "What is the Sunflower Mercenary Group?" "God knows. Don't doubt the vice-captain's naming ability. Did you know that her first cat was called Grayle? Grayle's daughter was called Whitey, and Whitey's son was called Blackie. What about the dark-skinned son or daughter?" No, there was one time when the deputy commander didn't hold it as tightly as he did when he was bringing it out. It ran away like it was flying and never came back. That's really sad. The knight could not help but laugh as he pulled out his long sword while talking and laughing. The wind carried the conversation of the Rubik's people to Brando's ears. He looked in that direction. It was the Knights of Ra's Wings. No wonder the quality of these knights was so high. That was Rubik's Knights of the Holy Temple. They were the core force that guarded the Sun Temple. Their status was similar to Cruz's Flame Knight, but their numbers were less than half of Flame's. Mr. Blank, Brando said, I'll leave Miss Magadal to you. It might be difficult to take care of her on the battlefield. Blank nodded. Medisha, I'll leave the rest to you. The silver elf princess nodded silently. She raised her right hand and a shining silver card spun in her palm, and finally turned into a long horn. The long sound of the horn echoed throughout the battlefield. Whose horn is that? She turned her head and looked at the officials. Maybe it's their horn. For the past few days they haven't sounded their horn. Why would they suddenly sound it today? We don't quite understand, Your Majesty. Then go and find out. Yes, Your Majesty. She turned around, her black robe flowing across the marble platform like water. The scepter in her pale hand was flowing with a mercury-like luster. Her pale face did not seem to have the emotions of a living person. It was cold, indifferent, and unhurried. The undead regained their footing, and the white fog was eroding the entire battlefield. Thousands of knights lined up in a long line, like an invisible blade cutting into the army of the crystal cluster. When the knight collided with the crystal cluster, there was no sound. There was neither a shout nor the sound of metal colliding. It was like a silent image, a replay of the scene from 1,000 years ago. The illusory knight passed directly by the crystal cluster like a ghost. But the image returned to normal in the next moment. The surface of the crystal cluster that came into contact with the lost names quickly lost its color, became dim, and then shattered into colorless and transparent crystal fragments. This invisible blade swept across the left wing of the battlefield, and the crystal cluster army there immediately collapsed. A huge gap appeared on the battlefield, as if as long as the undead seized this opportunity, they could turn defeat into victory and win the battle in one fell swoop. But the 7 undead legions were powerless. The enemy, at least 20 times their number, was firmly nailing every bit of the undead's reserve forces in place. The crystal cluster's work was disorderly but effective. Like their opponents, they were not afraid of death. The black eyes of the person holding the mercury staff were cold. She did not give any orders, as if this battle, which concerned the survival of the Roman Black Rose, had nothing to do with her. But everyone understood that at this point in the war the rest was up to fate. If the dead moon still cared for everyone. Woo woo woo. The long sound of the horn sounded again. Andrea and her colleagues were coming out of a crystal forest, and the battle of the entire Finhodos Strait was presented before these 122 war goddesses. In the southern part of the inner sea of the Dead Moon, there was no landmark named Finhodos, and the reason why this place was called the Strait was because it was located between the Calm Sea and the Lunar Sea. The names of these two seas were said to come from an ancient inheritance, and the only land protruding from the sea between them could be called the Strait. Outside the elemental frontier there was no real sea. Even if there was seawater, it had long been exhausted by the frenzied magic that escaped in the tens of thousands of years of war. This was a world without life. But there was hope in silence, and it was because of its existence that Wand was like a baby in swaddling clothes, nurturing life and the future in its sleep. The mothers gave the two to the two worlds. As the elder brother, it was his duty to protect this world. The people who were born here never regretted it because they believed that one day the support from their grown brother would completely rewrite this war. That was the only hope of this world. This world was called Magritos, which meant the frontier. This was the frontier of civilization. Andrea looked at everything on the battlefield, and for a moment, thousands of memories appeared in her mind. Most of these memories didn't come from her, but from the last moments of countless ancestors who had sacrificed themselves on the battlefield. Their experiences and hopes were engraved in the hearts of all the descendants. One day the people we protect from another world will come here from the other side of the door. The power of the growing civilization will ultimately obtain victory in the eternal war. We can't hold on any longer. Day after day, year after year, where are they? Have we been abandoned, Lady Martha? I don't want to die. Andrea, I'm in pain. They're here, Andrea said softly, sisters. Although they were still weak, the seed of hope had been planted. One day it would grow into a towering tree. In this way this war had a meaning. Andrea turned around. Sisters, prepare for battle. The heroic spirits can't hold on for long. The key is to tell everyone that the Earth Legion is still fighting. She put on her helmet. Everyone did the same thing and put on their helmets. The helmet was very different from the wand. It didn't have a metallic luster on the surface. Instead, it looked more like a crystal mask. It was dark and reflected a dark green light. Rows of data flowed down from the black crystal mask like a waterfall and reflected in Andrea's eyes. Then it merged into one and formed a spinning mark of Tiamat. Requesting high-level agreement authorization. Connecting to the battlefield. Requesting battlefield data link. Loading Tiamat system. Authority, Goddess of War. 120 people raised their heads slightly at the same time. A bright silver mark appeared on their foreheads. Flying mode. Andrea's voice reached the ears of all her companions through the telepathic communication system. Only the will couldn't be destroyed. On the battlefield at dusk, telepathic communication was the safest way to transmit information. Legend had it that this was a system developed by the divine people and planeswalkers. 122 wings of light stretched out from their backs at the same time. Requesting Nucleus 14 to drop weapons, ambush configuration. Andrea looked up. In the sky, 3 huge spots of light appeared above the clouds. They were 3 magic arrays formed by crisscrossing lines of law. They corresponded to the stars of the Dragon of War, Tiamat. The huge magic array rotated like a gear. Every time it rotated, it swept away the thick clouds. Beams of light fell from the sky and landed in various positions on the battlefield. Andrea raised her hand, and a beam of light immediately appeared in her hand. The beam of light condensed into a pitch-black blade in a few seconds. Then the beam of light fell on her body. A streamlined armor immediately covered her body. "Get ready to go," she shouted in a low voice. "Wait, there's a higher authority on the battlefield." Suddenly, someone cried out in alarm. There was panic in the communication channel. For the first time in 1,600 years, the footprints of the divine people appeared outside the elemental frontier again. Andrea suppressed the shock in her heart. She whispered to her companions, "Don't panic. Lock onto his position and ask who he is. Is it Gaia's will? Or is it the truth? Andrea?" The voice in the communication channel was almost crying. "His authority is too high. The system told us that we can't request it. Oh my God, look at that mark. That is? No. He's not the first generation. Martha above, the divine people. 7,000 years later. The divine people returned to Wand. Chapter 1297. The lost names suddenly stopped on the battlefield. The pale knights were looking back and tens of thousands of eyes were cast to the rear of the battlefield. Rows of illusory knights stood in place, as if silently waiting for something. "What's the matter?" The supreme of the undead was slightly startled. She saw pillars of light connecting heaven and earth, distributed throughout the battlefield. A new force had intervened in the battle. Who was it? Everyone mounted their horses. Brando raised his sword, and the golden light of Odorfice shone with a strange light in the sun. 1,000 years ago, mortals fought for their fate under this sword. 1,000 years later, it became a flag again, and this time, it would rewrite the fate of Wand. "Medisha, raise our banner and tell the world that this is the battle of Erwin's people. Victory!" The knights shouted in unison and burst down from the high ground at the edge of the forest. At this moment, Erwin's people, Rubik's people, Nine Phoenix's people, Rosaline's people, even Fang Chi and his men. Everyone no longer had any other thoughts, only to fight and win. And if they failed, it would be nothing more than being buried on the battlefield. For these people, death was not worth mentioning. Every single one of them was proud. Fight for honor. Fight for victory. The little silver elf princess looked up and threw out a silver card. The card flipped in the air, turned into a beam of light and shot straight up into the sky. Then the clouds parted left and right, and a ray of light fell from the sky, shining on everyone's head. "May I be honored and then I can honor you." Medisha held a spear and shouted, "Eternal song of reincarnation," gently waving on the battlefield. Knights, encouragement light armor emerged from her body, and a stream of light went up against the spears held tightly by the knights, turning into a brilliant silver flag at the tip of the spear. On the flag, the silver crescent moon and lily were dazzling beyond compare. Above the sky, a golden eye slowly opened, and she looked at the ground with a thoughtful expression. "Planeswalker, I didn't think there would be planeswalkers in this world." "That's good, then the inheritance won't be severed." Light swords descended from above the clouds and pierced straight into the ground. Brando took the lead and light followed him. The mystical horse he was sitting on seemed to be stepping on clouds, galloping as if it was flying. The holy sword Odorfice in its hand was pointed forward, reflecting a burning golden line under the sunlight. The golden line was cutting into the gap between the crystal cluster and the lost names. The multicolored light descending from the clouds also advanced, plowing into the great army of crystal clusters. Cavalry? The undead lords who were commanding on the high ground saw this scene very clearly and were shocked. Who is that? Look at their banners, they're displaying their banners. That is, Silver New Moon and Lily flag. What flag is that? Did one of the lords in the south join the war? They turned around and looked at the woman holding the Mercury staff behind them. But the monarch of the undead did not say a word. At this moment, this sudden cavalry became the last reserve force of the undead, and under the command of 2 people, it hit the most critical place on the battlefield. The cavalry was ready, and the glory was inspiring. Incersta felt as if he had returned to before the age of 18, when he was still a human and had not transformed into what he was now. There was still blood in his heart, and he was full of hope to give everything for the rising of the dead moon. The reason of the undead gave him and Tarkus an excellent combination, but the enthusiasm of the early years in his heart was long gone. The rise of the empire had become a cold and step-by-step process, and the reason why the undead had a tendency to self-destruction may have stemmed from such contradictory feelings. No undead was willing to fight side by side with the living, let alone such a motley army from all over the world. That kind of complicated feelings maintained their existence. Disgust, calmness, and a certain goal. For the new generation of Madara, only eternal death was the arrival of some kind of peace. But at this moment, he seemed to feel his beating heart and the majestic pulsing blood. He looked back at Tarkus and saw the same color in his eyes. What was going on? Everyone's morale was at its peak, and they could not help but look forward. Brando's back on the horse seemed to be crowned with an invisible halo. It was a pair of wings made of light and it infected everyone. Perhaps it was not impossible to die in this battle. His second thought was that the Silver Elf Princess had a keen sense of the battlefield, and she was not inferior to him in the slightest. Both of them had found the weakest point on the battlefield at the first moment. But it was not enough. Brando raised his head and looked at the purple wall in front of him that was getting closer and closer. He withdrew his sword, and a golden halo bounced off from his body, suddenly enveloping everyone around him. The knight crashed into it in an instant. Incersta let out an ear-piercing shriek. Other than Magadol and Delphine, he could be said to be the weakest in the group. Even Phoenix Fire's combat skills were better than his by at least 3 points. He wasn't an undead lord who would charge into battle in the first place. But even so, he was not afraid because of this. The emotions of the dead were indifferent, and their understanding of existence and death was very different from that of the living. He screamed because of the hysteria in his heart. I have to kill at least one, he thought to himself. He was also very clear about the strength of these crystal clusters. On this battlefield, the crystal clusters that appeared were far stronger than the monsters around Rosaline. Their average strength was almost above the elemental awakening. But even so, he saw a crystal cluster raise its sickle-like claws towards him. The future star of Madara closed his eyes subconsciously, almost thinking about how he could minimize the damage. He did not expect to be able to avoid it. The opponent's movements were much faster than his. And at this moment he felt the spear in his hand respond with a solid touch. I stabbed it. The spear seemed to have stabbed into tofu, and without any resistance, it lifted the crystal armor on the surface of the crystal cluster and stabbed directly into it. The monster let out a scream and swept its claws towards him. Incersta's eyes widened as he saw the claws hit his chest heavily, then twisted, deformed, and shattered into countless scattered crystal fragments, which scattered in all directions. This, conflict halo? Blank whispered, such a high-level conflict halo, master is a Templar Knight master. Incersta was stunned and he rushed straight over, thinking in his heart, isn't he a grand sword master? Brando and his knight were like a hammer, smashing heavily into the purple sea, and all the crystal clusters that dared to block them were immediately turned into dust. The group of knights who were originally elemental knights, together with the cavalry equipment, the buffs of inspiration and the conflict halo, had now become an unstoppable blade, cutting a path through the swarm of crystal clusters. Medisha. Brando suddenly reined in the reins, turned around, and faced the army of crystal clusters that were rushing towards them. He stretched out the holy sword Odorfice and swept forward, and a golden sword light flew forward. The golden line extended to hundreds of feet in an instant on the battlefield, and wherever it passed, the crystal clusters were cut in half. After passing through as many as 7 or 8 layers, the crystal clusters in front were all shorter, like a sickle sweeping through wheat stubble. Medisha understood tacitly, and she understood that the Lord was buying time for her. She pointed her spear to the sky and shouted, "Heaven's armor!" Thousands of silver lines fell from the sky. Each line was connected to a crystal cluster on the ground. Medisha swung her spear from top to bottom. Countless light pillars fell from the clouds along this silver line, and flames burned from the top of the heads. Those crystal clusters had no resistance at all, and were already turned into ashes. The front was suddenly empty. The undead lords were already stunned. Vanzan's people? When did they come here? While the lower-level lords were in a daze, the higher-level lords did not waste any time. This was because the sudden appearance of the cavalry cut through the gap between the Madara's undead and the Crystal Cluster army, causing the enemy's attack to pause for a moment. At least the flanks of 3 legions were thus freed. The Supreme with the Mercury staff decisively gave an order, and she pointed forward with the staff in her hand. "Cooperate with them, attack. But we need the bone dragons, more bone dragons, your majesty. Then go and find them." "Bezos it, don't tell me the reason, I only want the answer. If you can't do it, I will let someone who can do it replace you," she replied coldly. A few minutes later, tens of thousands of bone vultures flew from Madara's position, and they were not inferior to the Crystal Cluster Army's power in the sky. Unfortunately, they were too little of a threat to the Crystal Cluster Army. As soon as they took to the sky, they fell down like rain. Everyone knew that the undead's air force would not last long. Brando suddenly stopped. "There's a fluctuation of magic," White Mist whispered on his shoulder. "What's that?" Someone was screaming. Brando looked up. In midair, Leviathan was turning around. It was slightly injured earlier, but it was not worth mentioning for its huge body. It let out a piercing scream above the clouds, and countless crystal clusters swooped down from midair as if they had received an order. Their attack was unusually simple, and they fell directly into the undead army's camp like a rainstorm. In the blink of an eye, the undead army's front line was broken into pieces. But this was not what really made him look solemn. Above the clouds, a dense mass of black dots suddenly appeared. They passed by the Crystal Cluster Army, and in an instant they were above the battlefield. At a distance of more than 10 miles, Brando could see the true colors of these black dots at a glance. Isaac, who was standing behind the Most High, put down the monocular in his hand with a solemn expression. He quietly held the brass casing of the magic device, and his hands were a little pale. Unlike the other undead creatures present, he was a human, and a necromancer with a very high position in the kingdom of the Dead Moon. But unlike the liches who yearned for immortality, the human necromancers always had the various weaknesses of their kind. Weak, timid, greedy for life, greedy for power, as if they were not worth mentioning in this highly efficient kingdom. But in fact, it was these people who supported the reform of the undead transformation. He was on this battlefield to see with his own eyes the extent to which the new alchemy could improve the newly born undead creatures. The experiment went smoothly. But at this moment, Isaac did not feel the slightest bit of joy in his heart. "It's a horseshoe worm?" His voice was a little distorted. "You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."